Welcome back everyone. Today, we're continuing with the next part of this series, called What If Goku Remembered the Saiyans? My name is Ash. Please, for me, drop a like and subscribe to the page. Also leave your comments down below. With that, let's begin. Kakarot sat cross-legged on the rocky terrain of Yardrat, his eyes closed and his breathing steady. The stillness around him was broken only by the occasional whistle of the wind. It had been nearly a year since his battle against Frieza, a fight that had pushed him to awaken the power of the legendary Super Saiyan. But with that power came an unsettling lack of control. For months, the mere thought of Frieza's cruelty was enough to trigger the transformation. Now, after relentless meditation and training, Kakarot was closer than ever to mastering his newfound abilities. As his mind focused, he felt the familiar surge of energy bubbling beneath the surface, a wild force demanding release. Slowly he stood, his movements deliberate and calculated, his fists clenched tightly by his sides as he honed in on the energy within. The ground beneath him trembled as gusts of wind swirled in every direction, whipping his orange gi and untamed hair. His black locks flickered, glowing golden for brief moments before reverting. Then, with one final push, his hair and eyebrows turned a radiant gold, and his dark eyes shifted to an intense teal. The transformation was complete. Kakarot lowered his arms and exhaled deeply. His surroundings were intact, untouched by the violent energy that had once caused so much destruction whenever he powered up. A faint smile crossed his face. Finally, he muttered to himself, the golden aura dimming slightly but still present. He gazed out at the horizon, where the twin suns of Yardrat were beginning to set. His thoughts turned to Earth, to his wife and son. He missed them deeply, but his determination to protect them outweighed his longing. This was why he had stayed away, to ensure he could control this overwhelming power. Yeah, he murmured with resolve. Walking toward his spaceship, it's time to go home. As the ship's hatch opened with a soft hiss, Kakarot took one last look at the barren yet peaceful planet that had been his training ground. He stepped inside, thoughts of home filling his mind as the door sealed shut behind him. Bardock's training. Inside a high-tech gravity room on Earth, Bardock leaped through the air, sweat dripping from his forehead as he dodged and countered invisible attacks. Each punch and kick he threw carried the weight of someone determined to grow stronger. The gravity in the chamber was set to 150 times Earth's normal pull, a level most would find unbearable. For Bardock, it was a challenge he welcomed. He landed with a thud, the metallic floor groaning under the force of his landing. Without hesitation, he sprang back into action, his movements swift and precise. The chamber's artificial gravity pushed against him, testing his every move. "Come on, old man," Bardock grunted, imagining his father standing in front of him. "I'll show you I'm not a kid anymore." But as much as he tried to focus on his training, there was an ache in his heart. He missed his father, Kakarot. Sparring against empty air just wasn't the same. He needed a real opponent, someone to push him to his limits. Bardock paused, catching his breath. His tail swished lazily behind him as he looked around the room. The advanced equipment was a gift from his mother, Bulma, for his last birthday. She had designed it to exceed the capabilities of any other gravity chamber, but she had sworn him to secrecy about its true limit. Not a word to anyone about it going over 100 times gravity, she had warned. "I don't need a bunch of Saiyans pestering me to build them one." He smirked at the memory, but his smile faded as the emptiness of the room reminded him again of his father's absence. Bardock let out a long sigh and deactivated the gravity controls. The oppressive weight lifted, and he stretched his arms above his head. Raditz, his uncle, had been busy training with Nappa most of the time. The two full-blooded Saiyans had grown closer recently, leaving Bardock with fewer chances to spar with them. Vegeta? Well, Vegeta was Vegeta. Bardock rolled his eyes at the thought of the prince. "At least Mom lets me train," he muttered, stepping out of the chamber. He grabbed a towel and wiped the sweat from his face. After they'd returned from Namek, his mother had insisted he balance training with education. Bardock still shuddered at the memory of her ultimatum: study at home or go to school. "No way was I going to school," he said to himself, chuckling. Instead, he'd agreed to complete his schoolwork at home. It wasn't too bad. Most days, he could finish it in a few hours and still have time to train. After experiencing the terror of Frieza firsthand, Bardock had vowed to become stronger. He didn't know what other threats might be out there, but he wasn't going to be caught unprepared. He stepped outside, feeling the crisp air against his skin. Looking up at the sky, he clenched his fist. "Dad, wherever you are, you'd better be ready," he said, determination gleaming in his eyes. "When you get back, I'll be strong enough to take you on." Bardock froze mid-strike as a wave of energy pulsed through him, making every hair on his body stand on end. The raw, immense power heading toward Earth was unmistakable and terrifying. It wasn't his father. The energy felt dark, almost suffocating, but it carried an unsettling familiarity. His mind raced to connect the dots. Then it hit him like a punch to the gut. "Frieza?" he muttered under his breath, his voice trembling slightly. No, that couldn't be. Frieza was dead. He had seen it with his own eyes. Shaking off his shock, Bardock quickly refocused. "Gravity off," he barked. The room responded instantly, returning to normal conditions. Without hesitation, Bardock blasted through the gravity chamber's doors, the air around him crackling as he shot into the sky. The wind roared past his ears as he flew toward the source of the power. He pushed himself faster, the uneasy feeling gnawing at his stomach. If this energy was anything like Frieza's, then Earth was in grave danger. Before long, he noticed two figures closing in on him. Raditz and Nappa quickly caught up, their determined expressions matching the gravity of the situation. "You know Mom's gonna kill you, right?" Raditz said, his tone dry but laced with concern. "Rushing off to fight something like this on your own? Not your smartest move, kid." Bardock smirked, though the tension in his jaw betrayed his nerves. "Well, that's why I let you two come along. You're my backup plan." "Backup plan, huh?" Nappa chuckled, his deep voice carrying a mix of pride and excitement. "Good to know we're still useful." Bardock slowed his flight, letting the older warriors close the distance. Despite the banter, all three knew this wasn't a time for jokes. The ominous power was growing stronger by the second, and whatever, or whoever, was behind it, they would have to face it together. Inside another gravity chamber, Krillin was gasping for breath as he completed his 10,000th push-up. Sweat dripped off his nose, pooling on the sleek metal floor beneath him. His body ached, but he welcomed the pain. It was a constant reminder of how far he had come since the last time he died, a humiliation he vowed never to endure again. 9 months ago, he'd been wished back to life, after dying in yet another unwinnable battle. The sting of defeat and helplessness still haunted him, driving him to train harder than ever before. Every day, he pushed himself to his limits, refusing to be a liability to his friends. As he rose to his feet, Krillin's sharp senses flared, and his heart sank. An enormous power was hurtling toward Earth. His first thought was disbelief. This energy felt faintly familiar, but it was steeped in malice. "This can't be good," he muttered, grabbing a towel to wipe his face. The air in the chamber seemed heavier as dread settled in his chest. Whoever, or whatever, was coming, their intent was anything but friendly. Without wasting another second, Krillin powered up and launched himself into the sky, speeding toward the source of the disturbance. Chi-Chi stood in Yamcha's bedroom, holding a pair of pink panties between her thumb and forefinger like they were radioactive. Her face was a mask of fury, her lips pressed into a thin line. "What are these?" she demanded, her voice sharp as a blade. Yamcha, standing awkwardly near the doorway, froze. His eyes darted to the offending garment in her hand. He cleared his throat, trying to stall for time. "They're a gift for you, of course." Chi-Chi's eyebrows shot up in disbelief. "Oh, really? Then why do they reek of perfume, and not mine, I might add?" She stepped closer, her voice rising with each word. "If you were going to cheat on me, the least you could do was get rid of the evidence before inviting me over." "Wait, I can explain?" Yamcha stammered, holding his hands up defensively. "Explain?" Chi-Chi scoffed, her voice dripping with venom. "There's nothing to explain. We're done, Yamcha." Before he could say another word, she spun on her heel and stormed out, slamming the door behind her. Yamcha was left standing alone in the wreckage of his relationship. He sighed heavily, running a hand through his hair. Great, just great. In truth, he couldn't blame her. He had cheated, and now it had come back to bite him. That night with the random woman at the bar had been a mistake, a stupid, drunken mistake. But regrets wouldn't fix this now. As he stood there wallowing in self-pity, a sudden surge of energy jolted him out of his thought. His head snapped up, his senses locking on to the power heading toward Earth. "Seriously? Now?" he groaned, rubbing the back of his neck. "Couldn't this wait until after my life fell apart?" Despite his frustration, Yamcha knew he couldn't ignore the threat. With a deep breath, he powered up and took to the skies, heading straight for the source of the energy. Whatever it wasn't friendly, and he wasn't about to let Earth go undefended. Bardock, Raditz, and Nappa descended into a dense forest clearing, their boots crunching softly against the grass as they landed. The oppressive energy they had been tracking was growing stronger by the second. All three warriors felt the tension in the air, as if it were something solid pressing down on them. Raditz folded his arms and surveyed the area. "Now we wait," he said firmly. "Suppress your power levels. If they sense us, we'll lose any advantage we might have." Bardock and Nappa exchanged a brief glance before complying, their energy signatures fading into near nothingness. The oppressive weight of the approaching power wasn't lost on any of them. Bardock, fidgeting slightly, finally broke the silence. "How are we supposed to stop something like this?" he asked, trying to keep the nervousness out of his voice. "That power feels massive." Raditz's expression hardened. "We fight together," he said simply, his tone leaving no room for debate. "Only weaklings fight together," came a condescending voice from above. All three warriors turned to see Vegeta descending from the sky, his arms crossed, his trademark smirk firmly in place. "Nice of you to show up, Vegeta," Bardock said dryly, his words laced with sarcasm. Raditz stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. "You're a fool if you believe that," he said coldly. "You know as well as I do you don't stand a chance against that power alone." Vegeta's smirk twitched, but he refused to back down. "Not yet," he admitted. "But when I ascend to a Super Saiyan, I'll crush them with ease." "If you ever ascend," Nappa said with a scoff, "you're not even sure it's possible for you. What if Kakarot is the only one who can become a Super Saiyan? You might never—" "You insolent oaf," Vegeta snarled, raising a glowing hand as energy crackled in his palm. "I will ascend. I will surpass all of you." Nappa smirked and stepped forward, his massive frame squaring off with the prince. "Then prove it," he said, his voice calm but full of challenge. "I'm not afraid of you anymore, Vegeta. You're strong, but you're not invincible. And you definitely haven't mastered the Kaioken." Before Vegeta could unleash his attack, a new voice cut through the tension. "Enough!" Piccolo's deep, gravelly voice silenced the argument as he stepped into view from the shadows of the forest. His arms were crossed, and his stern glare pinned both Vegeta and Nappa in place. "You two idiots want to broadcast our location? Because that's exactly what you're doing." Vegeta growled, but lowered his hand, the energy dissipating. Nappa huffed and took a step back, though his smirk remained. "Fine," Vegeta muttered. "But when this is over, we're settling this." "Whatever you say, Prince," Nappa replied, rolling his eyes. Piccolo ignored the exchange and turned his attention to the horizon. His antennae twitched slightly as he focused on the approaching powers. "There's more than one," he said grimly. Bardock frowned. "More than one? What do you mean?" Piccolo nodded. "Two distinct powers," he clarified, "and they're both significant. But that's not all. It feels like they brought an army with them." Raditz cursed under his breath. "An army? Great. Just what we needed." Before anyone could respond, Krillin landed in the clearing, his orange GI slightly scuffed from his rapid flight. "Nice of you to join us," Raditz said, his tone dry but tinged with respect. Krillin offered a small smile. "Figured you could use some backup." Raditz gave him a once-over and nodded approvingly. "You've gotten stronger," he admitted. "I've been training like crazy," Krillin replied. "After what happened on Namek, I can't let myself be weak again." "Yeah, it shows," came Tien's voice, as he and Yamcha landed nearby. Yamcha rubbed the back of his neck, his expression sheepish. "I gotta say, I'm feeling a bit outclassed here," he admitted. "I should have trained harder." "You think?" Raditz muttered under his breath. "Quiet," Piccolo ordered, his sharp gaze snapping to the sky. "It's landing." All heads turned toward the horizon as a massive flying saucer descended through the clouds. The air grew heavy with malevolence as the ship settled onto the ground with a low, mechanical hum. The ship's hatch opened slowly, steam hissing as the ramp lowered. From the shadows within, two figures emerged. The first was a familiar sight, though not one anyone had hoped to see again. A white alien with purple accents on his elbows, knees, and head stepped forward, his mechanical tail swishing behind him. His chest bore a metallic plate, covering what had once been a grievous wound. "Frieza," Bardock whispered, his fists clenching. But the second figure made even Frieza look small. The towering being stood nearly 8 feet tall, his armor a gleaming reminder of the Planet Trade Organization's grip on the galaxy. Two massive bull-like horns jutted from the sides of his head, and his purple skin was streaked with pink along his neck, arms, and legs. "King Cold," Piccolo muttered, his voice low and full of unease. The two aliens surveyed the area, their expressions a mix of disdain and cruel amusement. King Cold was the first to speak, his voice smooth and arrogant. "I still don't see why we didn't just destroy this planet from orbit," he said, glancing at Frieza. "I told you, father," Frieza sneered, his sharp voice dripping with venom. "I want my revenge on that insolent Saiyan who dared wound me so grievously. I'll leave this miserable planet in ruins, and when he returns, I'll personally see to his demise." King Cold raised an eyebrow, his towering frame exuding calm disdain. "If you can, that is," he said, his deep voice filled with cold amusement. "The last encounter didn't exactly go in your favor, did it?" He seemed to leave quite the impression on your pride and your body. Frieza's tail flicked angrily, the mechanical replacement clinking faintly. "I was caught off guard," he spat, his lips curling into a snarl. From their vantage point, Bardock clenched his fist, his knuckles turning white. "It's him," he said through gritted teeth. "It's Frieza. I thought my dad finished him off." "I guess he survived somehow," Raditz replied grimly, narrowing his eyes as he scanned the alien's mechanical enhancements. "Looks like he's had some upgrades after the beating Kakarot gave him." Nappa cracked his knuckles, the sound like distant thunder. "Let's make sure we finish the job this time," he said, a dangerous grin spreading across his face. "Where are these Earthlings?" King Cold drawled, his tone laced with boredom. His golden eyes scanned the horizon lazily, as if he were waiting for a servant to bring him tea. "I was under the impression they would sense our arrival and come groveling by now." "Patience, father," Frieza said, his smirk revealing razor-sharp teeth. "They'll come soon enough, and if they don't, I'll just have to speed up the process by tearing this planet apart piece by piece. That always gets their attention." King Cold shook his head disapprovingly. "So uncivilized," he muttered. Just as Frieza opened his mouth to reply, a lone figure descended from the cliffs above, his silhouette sharp against the bright sky. The air grew heavy as he floated down, landing gracefully in the clearing. "Frieza," Raditz said, his voice cold and steady as he stepped forward. "I see you're still alive." Frieza's eyes widened briefly before his lips curled into a cruel smile. "Well, well," he said mockingly. "If it isn't one of my runaway pet, I thought I'd lost you." Raditz's expression didn't waver. "We're not your pets anymore, Frieza," he said, his voice laced with defiance. "Kakarot defeated you once, and he'll do it again if he has to." Frieza chuckled darkly, the sound reverberating through the air. "Now that's amusing," he said. "But I'm afraid your dear brother isn't here to save you. He only left planet Yardred a few days ago. And from my calculations, he won't return for several hours. That's more than enough time for me to turn this planet into an empty wasteland. A nice welcoming gift for him, wouldn't you say?" "You'll have to get through me first," Raditz growled. His aura flared suddenly, a vibrant crimson that surged around him like a blazing inferno. The ground trembled beneath his feet as his power climbed higher and higher. Raditz clenched his fist, feeling his muscles strain under the intense pressure of the Kaioken technique. He had pushed it to X-25, knowing full well that it wouldn't be enough to defeat Frieza. But he also knew his limit, and that overextending himself could destroy his body. "Kakarot, you'd better get here soon," Raditz thought, his heart pounding in his chest. "I don't know how long I can hold him off." Bardock gritted his teeth as he watched Raditz square off against Frieza. His fingers twitched with the urge to join the fight. "Why are we just sitting here?" he hissed. "Raditz can't take him alone. He's going to need our help." "If we jump in now," Nappa said, his voice low but firm, "we'll lose our best advantage. Frieza doesn't know we're here. If we keep our power suppressed, we might actually catch him off guard. For now, hold your position." Bardock's tail flicked behind him restlessly, but he begrudgingly nodded, keeping his power low as they waited for the right moment. "Get him, men!" Frieza barked, his voice sharp and commanding. At his signal, hundreds of soldiers poured out from the ship, a chaotic swarm of various alien species, each armed to the teeth. They charged toward Raditz, their battle cries filling the air. Raditz didn't flinch. The first warrior lunged at him with a jagged blade, but Raditz caught the blade mid-swing with his bare hand. He drove his other fist through the soldier's chest, sending the lifeless body flying backward. A second attacker met an even swifter end, as Raditz unleashed a small, precise energy blast, obliterating the soldier in an instant. One by one, the warriors fell, their numbers thinning rapidly as Raditz moved like a whirlwind of destruction. Within seconds, the battlefield was silent again, the ground littered with smoking craters and lifeless bodies. Raditz lowered his hands, his chest heaving as his aura flared around him. He locked eyes with Frieza, his expression unyielding. "Impressive," King Cold said, his tone dripping with false admiration. "Now I can see why my son had so much trouble with you pesky Saiyans." Raditz didn't look away from Frieza. "Did you really think your men would stand a chance against me?" he asked, his voice steady but sharp. "Of course not," Frieza replied with a wicked grin. "But they're expendable, and, well, I do enjoy watching a good fight now and then. It's entertaining. Shall we get to it then?" King Cold's voice cut through the tense air like a blade. He tapped his fingers impatiently against his arm. "I must say, I'm starting to grow a bit bored with all this posturing." Frieza glanced at his father, a smirk creeping across his lips. "Oh, don't worry, father. I'm getting to it," he said with a dramatic flair, his voice laced with amusement. "I do enjoy a bit of theater, after all." Raditz floated closer, his crimson aura flaring faintly around him. He crossed his arms and smirked. "I'll tell you what, Frieza," he said, his voice calm but full of challenge. "I'll give you a free shot. One chance. Let's see what you've got." Frieza's eyes widened slightly before narrowing into gleaming slits. "Oh, how generous of you," he sneered. "But don't think you're in any position to be offering such deals. Still," he raised a finger, his smirk growing wider, "I'll humor you. Just don't dodge. Otherwise, this little attack of mine might accidentally wipe out your precious planet, and wouldn't that be a shame?" As he spoke, a small orb of energy began to form at the tip of his finger, crackling and pulsing with destructive force. The orb rapidly expanded, growing to the size of a basketball, its glow casting ominous shadows across the ground. Raditz held his ground, watching the tyrant's every move. But before Frieza could unleash his attack, a sharp, spinning blade of energy whizzed through the air with deadly precision. The Destructo disc struck Frieza from behind, slicing cleanly through his neck. His head separated from his body in an instant, both pieces falling unceremoniously to the ground. Krillin hovered in the air behind him, his red aura blazing like wildfire as the remains of the attack fizzled out in the air. "Nice assist," Raditz said, nodding appreciatively as he floated over to Frieza's lifeless body. Without hesitation, he raised his hand and unleashed a quick but powerful burst of energy. The blast incinerated what was left of the tyrant, leaving no trace behind. "That's the end of him," Raditz said firmly. "He won't be coming back this time." Krillin let his aura fade, his body trembling slightly as he caught his breath. Holding the Kaioken at X-35 had pushed him to his limit, but the payoff was undeniable. A small, exhausted smile spread across his face. "At least the training wasn't for nothing," he muttered, wiping sweat from his brow. Raditz turned his gaze to King Cold, his expression hardening. "Your turn," he said coldly, pointing at the towering figure. "You'll be joining your son in the other world soon enough." King Cold raised an eyebrow, his amusement evident. "Oh, will I now?" he asked, his voice calm but filled with menace. His body erupted with an intense aura of energy, causing the ground beneath him to crack and tremble. "I must admit, I'm rather impressed by your confidence, but it's misplaced." Cracks began forming all over King Cold's body, and radiant light escaped from the fractures. The fragments of his outer form shattered and flew in all directions, leaving the air heavy with shockwaves. When the light finally faded, King Cold stood transformed. His towering frame was leaner, but far more menacing, his blue skin shimmering with streaks of dark blue along his knees, elbows, and the crown of his now bald head. He looked eerily similar to Frieza's fourth form, but his aura radiated an even greater sense of terror. "I can achieve my full power in an instant," King Cold said with a cruel laugh. "Allow me to demonstrate." Raditz stared, frozen in disbelief. The sheer energy radiating from King Cold was overwhelming, unlike anything he had ever felt before. His hands trembled at his sides. He had faced Frieza with confidence, knowing he could push his Kaioken further if needed. But this was something entirely different. "Now," King Cold said, raising both hands as a colossal ball of energy formed between them. "Let's play a little game. I'll make it easy for you. It's the same one you played with my son. If you drop the ball," he paused, smirking as the massive sphere of energy crackled ominously. "The planet goes up in flames." Krillin's heart pounded in his chest as he watched the immense energy gather in King Cold's hand. His body screamed in protest, the strain from the previous battle still weighing on him. But he clenched his fists and let out a determined breath. "I can't just stand here," he muttered. His red aura flared to life again, crackling with intensity as he summoned another Destructo disc. The spinning blade of energy hummed in his hand, sharp and deadly. He raised the attack, preparing to strike, but before he could release it, King Cold's piercing eyes locked onto him. The tyrant smirked and in a flash fired a powerful blast in Krillin's direction. The monk barely had time to react. He dropped the Destructo disc and crossed his arms in front of his chest, bracing himself as the blast collided with him. The impact sent him hurtling backward, smoke and debris trailing behind him. King Cold chuckled, his voice dripping with malice. "Did you really think that little trick would work twice?" he taunted, turning his attention back to Raditz. Raditz's body tensed as King Cold hurled the massive ball of energy directly at him. The blazing sphere hurtled downward, its intense heat distorting the air as it descended. Before Cold could savor the moment, his attention was drawn to a pair of figures rushing toward him, a hulking bald Saiyan and a small boy with striking blue hair. Both radiated a fiery red aura, their energy blazing as they closed in with a synchronized flurry of punches and kicks aimed at the tyrant's face. To them, it might have seemed like they had a chance to turn the tide. To Cold, it was almost comical. The tyrant smirked and thrust his fist forward, driving it into the bald warrior's stomach with the force of a battering ram. The Saiyan's aura flickered and sputtered out as he doubled over, clutching his abdomen in agony. Cold chuckled, the sound deep and mocking, enjoying the pitiful display before him. But before he could revel further in his dominance, the boy's foot connected sharply with the side of his head. Cold didn't even flinch. His expression shifted to mild amusement as he turned his gaze to the young attacker. "You thought that would hurt?" Cold muttered, his voice dripping with disdain. Without hesitation, he seized the boy's leg in one swift motion. His grip was unyielding, and with a casual flick of his wrist, he spun the boy around like a ragdoll before hurling him toward the incapacitated bald warrior. The boy crashed into his companion, and both hit the ground in a heap, neither showing any sign of getting back up. Cold stretched, cracking his neck and rolling his shoulders. It had been a long time since he felt this comfortable in his true form, and this pathetic resistance only made his superiority more satisfying. His attention shifted back to Raditz, who was still struggling against the massive energy ball hurtling toward him. Cold's lips curled into a smug grin. There was no way the Saiyan could stop it. The destruction of this backwater planet was only moments away. Raditz, however, wasn't ready to give up. His crimson aura flared wildly as he planted his feet, his hands outstretched in a desperate attempt to hold back the attack. Sweat poured down his face, and his muscles strained as he shouted through gritted teeth, "I won't let this end here." The ground beneath him cracked and crumbled as the ball of energy pressed him down inch by inch. Realizing his limits were fast approaching, Raditz roared, "Kaioken, times 35. His aura exploded outward in a blazing inferno of red light, but even that wasn't enough. The energy continued to bear down, overpowering his strength. "I can't fail!" he screamed, his voice raw with desperation and determination. Suddenly, his red aura flickered, and his hair flashed gold for an instant. A surge of power tore through him like an unstoppable wave. His scream reached a fever pitch as his aura erupted, golden light now consuming him entirely. Raditz's hair remained gold, his eyes gleaming turquoise, as his power soared to unimaginable levels. With a thunderous roar, he pushed back against the attack, the energy ball lifting off the ground and sailing through the air, narrowly missing Cold as it shot into the atmosphere. Seconds later, it exploded harmlessly in space. Raditz stood tall, facing the tyrant with unyielding resolve. His golden aura swirled around him like a raging storm. The transformation had completed. Raditz had become a Super Saiyan. From a distance, Vegeta's voice rang out, his tone sharp with disbelief. How? His fists trembled at his sides as his eyes widened. How could he do it? It was already unbearable that Kakarot had surpassed him by achieving the legendary form, but now Raditz, the lowest of the low, had reached the same level. It was inconceivable. Raditz wasted no time. He launched himself toward King Cold, his newfound power surging through him with every step. His right fist shot forward, aimed directly at the tyrant's face. Cold raised a hand and blocked the attack effortlessly, his mocking laughter echoing across the battlefield. "Is that all you've got?" Cold taunted, his expression smug. Raditz's face twisted into a snarl. Wasting no time, he pivoted and slammed his left leg into Cold's ribs with a bone-crunching blow. The force sent Cold skidding backwards several feet, his smirk faltering for a moment. Raditz vanished in a blur, reappearing behind the tyrant with both fists raised high. He brought them down in a powerful axe-handle strike aimed at Cold's head, but Cold was ready. He raised his arms and blocked the attack, the impact sending a shockwave rippling outward. With a smirk returning to his face, Cold whipped his tail around, striking Raditz across the face. The blow sent the golden-haired Saiyan crashing into the ground with a resounding boom. Dust and debris filled the air as Raditz's body hit the dirt with brutal force. Raditz staggered to his feet, his body aching from the relentless assault. He wiped a trickle of blood from the corner of his mouth with the back of his hand. Despite the immense power coursing through him in his Super Saiyan form, it was clear that this fight would push him to his absolute limit. His golden aura flickered, but held steady as he steadied himself, his expression hardening into one of determination. He extended his arms wide, crackling energy forming in each hand. The intense light of his ki illuminated the battlefield as he brought his palms together. "Double Sunday!" he shouted, his voice echoing with raw power, as a massive beam of energy erupted from his hands and shot straight toward King Cold. The tyrant watched the incoming attack with an air of calculated calm. Crossing his arms in front of him, he braced himself, allowing the energy to collide head-on. The explosion lit up the sky, a deafening roar accompanying the surge of power. Smoke and debris engulfed Cold's figure as the ground trembled beneath their feet. When the dust cleared, King Cold stood firm, his arms lowering as his crimson eyes locked onto Raditz. His body bore marks of the attack. Burns and bruises speckled his pale skin, but his grin was unshaken. "Impressive," he admitted with a cold chuckle. "I can see why my son might have found this Super Saiyan transformation problematic." His expression hardened, a malicious glint in his eye. "But let me make something very clear. I am not Frieza." Before Raditz could react, Cold vanished in an instant. The air seemed to shift behind him, and a crushing blow struck his side, driving Cold's fist deep into his kidney. Raditz let out a choked gasp of pain as his body doubled forward. Cold grabbed a fistful of his spiky golden hair, yanking him backward and slamming his face into the tyrant's armored knee with sickening force. Raditz's vision blurred as Cold held him suspended by his hair, like a predator toying with its prey. The tyrant's fists became a blur, raining punch after punch into Raditz's stomach and chest. Each strike echoed like thunder, and the Saiyan's golden aura flickered with every blow. Within minutes, the brilliant gold faded entirely, replaced by the dull black of his natural state. His body went limp in Cold's grasp. The tyrant sneered as he lifted Raditz higher, letting his unconscious form dangle lifelessly. "Done already?" Cold mocked, shaking the Saiyan like a broken doll. "How disappointing. I expected more from a so-called Super Saiyan." Raditz, of course, didn't answer. Cold sighed and tossed the unconscious Saiyan aside, letting his body tumble across the ground like discarded trash. Turning his attention to the desolate battlefield, he raised a hand, energy gathering at his fingertips. "I suppose I'll just finish you off now," he mused. And then, of course, this miserable planet. Before he could fire, a calm but firm voice cut through the chaos. "No, you'll face me first." Cold paused, turning his head toward the source of the challenge. A new figure stood defiantly in the distance, slowly stepping forward with a measured pace. This Saiyan was leaner than Raditz, but carried himself with an unshakable confidence. He wore a green one-piece fighting uniform with black undershirt and wristband, and his hair, though much shorter than Raditz's, spiked up in a familiar way. Cold's eyes narrowed as he sized up the newcomer. "And who might you be?" he asked, his tone laced with condescension. The warrior stopped, crossing his arms over his chest. "Kakarot," he replied evenly, his voice brimming with quiet menace. "And I'm the one who's going to end you." Cold's lips curled into a smirk. "Ah, another one of you monkeys. Let me guess. Another transformation? Gold hair? Sparkly aura?" He chuckled dryly. "Your friend tried that already. It didn't go very well for him." Kakarot's expression didn't waver. Without a word, his black hair began to shimmer and shift, turning bright gold in a flash. His turquoise eyes locked onto Cold's as his golden aura erupted around him like a blazing inferno. "We'll see," Kakarot said, a confident grin spreading across his face. Cold's smirk faded as he rushed forward, feinting to the left with blinding speed. Kakarot vanished before the attack could land, reappearing several feet away in the blink of an eye. But Cold was prepared. The moment Kakarot reappeared, the tyrant was on him, driving a fist into his face with devastating force. Kakarot flew backward from the impact, flipping through the air before regaining his balance mid-flight. Without hesitation, Kakarot rocketed back toward Cold, his aura leaving a golden streak in his wake. Cold stood his ground, a sly grin creeping back onto his face as he swung his leg in a wide arc. The strike seemed to land cleanly, aimed directly at Kakarot's midsection, but it passed harmlessly through an afterimage. The real Kakarot reappeared behind him, both fists raised high. With a roar, Kakarot brought his fist crashing down onto the back of Cold's head. The tyrant's body shot downward like a missile, slamming toward the ground below. But before Cold could hit the earth, Kakarot was already there, waiting with an energy blast, charged and ready. "Take this!" Kakarot shouted, unleashing the blast directly at Cold. The attack struck with incredible force, halting Cold's descent and engulfing him in a blinding explosion of light and power. King Cold struggled to regain control, the force of Kakarot's energy blast still sending him spiraling through the air. His mind reeled with disbelief. How had this Saiyan managed to strike with such speed and precision? The tyrant gritted his teeth, straining against the searing energy. But before he could break free, Kakarot appeared behind him once more. Without hesitation, the Super Saiyan hurled another energy blast, its brilliant glow cutting through the sky like a comet. Cold barely had a moment to register the attack before it collided with his back, pinning him between the two bursts of ki. The resulting explosion was deafening, a colossal shockwave rippling across the battlefield and shaking the earth to its core. Dust and smoke billowed outward, forcing the Z-fighters watching from a distance to shield their faces against the sheer force of the blast. When the dust finally began to settle, all eyes turned skyward. King Cold emerged from the smoke, his body battered and broken. Burns covered his once pristine form, blood oozed from numerous wounds, and his breath came in ragged gasps. He clutched his side, favoring ribs that were undoubtedly cracked, if not shattered. His crimson eyes darted around, searching for his opponent, expecting another sudden strike. But Kakarot wasn't hiding. He floated calmly in the air a short distance away, his golden aura shimmering around him like a blazing sun. His expression was steady, confident, as if daring Cold to make his next move. "You dirty monkey!" Cold spat through gritted teeth, venom dripping from every word. "I never understood why my son allowed even one of your wretched kind to live." Kakarot tilted his head, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Oh, poor thing. Doesn't feel so good when someone stronger comes along, does it?" Cold's face twisted in rage. "Stronger?" He barked out a laugh, though it was laced with bitterness. "You ignorant fool. You think this is my full strength? Once you've seen my true power, you'll regret every second of your arrogance." Kakarot's smirk widened into a toothy grin, his turquoise eyes sparkling with amusement. "If you've got a true power, then go ahead and show me. I'm dying to see what you've got." Cold's fists clenched tightly at his sides, his body trembling as his anger reached its boiling point. With a guttural roar, his crimson aura flared to life, crackling with raw energy. His muscles swelled as his body surged with power, his transformation visibly straining the air around him. The light of his aura faded slightly as he completed his power-up, his bulkier frame now radiating renewed strength. Despite his transformation, his appearance had not changed much, but the oppressive energy pouring off of him was palpable. "Now, Saiyan," Cold growled, his voice low and dangerous. "Shall we finish this?" Kakarot raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. Before he could respond, Cold was already moving, his massive frame cutting through the air with terrifying speed. Kakarot's instincts screamed at him as Cold's left hook closed in, aiming to take his head clean off. He barely managed to raise his arm in time, blocking the blow. The impact was immense, a shockwave ripping through the air as the force of the punch sent vibrations down his entire body. Kakarot grunted, the sheer power behind Cold's attack catching him off guard. The tyrant didn't let up for a second. Punches and kicks rained down in a relentless assault, each one faster and more precise than the last. Kakarot did his best to parry and dodge, but Cold's raw power was overwhelming. Finally, the tyrant's fist broke through his defenses, slamming into Kakarot's chest with enough force to send him flying backward like a cannonball. Before Kakarot could regain control, Cold's tail lashed out, wrapping around his ankle in a vice-like grip. The tyrant yanked him back with brutal strength, dragging the Super Saiyan into range for his next move. Cold brought his head forward in a vicious headbutt, the sharp crack of impact echoing across the battlefield. Blood spattered from Kakarot's nose and mouth as his head snapped back, his vision blurring from the brutal blow. Cold's grin widened, sensing the opening. Without missing a beat, the tyrant threw a devastating left hook, the punch rocketing toward Kakarot's temple with terrifying precision. Kakarot raised two fingers to his forehead, just as King Cold's punch came hurtling toward him. In the blink of an eye, he vanished, teleporting away mere milliseconds before the blow could connect. He reappeared below and behind the tyrant, catching sight of Cold's confused expression as the changeling frantically glanced around, trying to locate his opponent. Taking advantage of the brief moment of respite, Kakarot exhaled sharply, trying to catch his breath. Cold was not only powerful, but relentless, and Kakarot knew it would take every ounce of his strength to end this battle. The Super Saiyan didn't give Cold time to recover. Phasing back into view directly in front of him, Kakarot unleashed a crushing punch into the tyrant's stomach. The impact was immediate and brutal. Cold's crimson eyes widened as blood spurted from his mouth, and he doubled over in agony. Kakarot didn't waste the opportunity. He stepped back, cupping his hands at his side, energy already swirling between his palms. Me, he began, his voice steady but charged with determination. King Cold growled, pushing through the pain, and swung a wild fist toward Kakarot's head. But before the blow could land, Kakarot vanished again, teleporting behind the tyrant in a flash. Ha! He roared, releasing the fully charged Kamehameha wave directly into Cold's back. The immense beam of energy engulfed the tyrant, blasting him forward with incredible force and sending him hurtling through the air. The attack, however, wasn't enough to keep King Cold down. From within the dissipating wave, the changeling emerged, battered but far from defeated. His crimson aura flared as he rocketed back toward Kakarot with a feral snarl, his eyes burning with rage. In a flash, he closed the distance, moving so quickly that Kakarot had no time to react. Cold's hand shot out, seizing Kakarot by the neck in an iron grip. The Super Saiyan gagged, struggling for air, as Cold's fingers tightened around his windpipe. Kakarot's hands clawed at the tyrant's arm, his fists slamming against it in desperate attempts to free himself, but Cold's grip didn't falter. "You're not slipping away this time, Saiyan," Cold hissed, his voice dripping with malice. With a sudden burst of speed, he shot forward, slamming Kakarot into the side of a massive cliff. The rocky surface cracked and shattered under the impact as Cold drove the Super Saiyan deeper and deeper into the earth. "This is the end for you," Cold sneered, his grip tightening further. "Now, die." Kakarot's vision blurred as the air was forced from his lungs, but even as darkness threatened to overtake him, his resolve flared. "I won't lose," he shouted, mustering the last of his strength. With a powerful kick, he struck Cold square in his broken ribs. The tyrant's eyes widened as pain shot through his body, forcing him to loosen his grip just enough for Kakarot's to slip free. Kakarot dropped to the ground, landing on his feet. Without hesitation, he followed up with a punishing right hook to Cold's injured ribs, the blow causing a sickening crunch. The tyrant howled in pain, clutching his side. Kakarot took advantage of the moment, phasing behind Cold and wrapping his arm tightly around the changeling's neck in a headlock. "This is for Raditz," Kakarot growled, shooting forward with incredible speed. He drove Cold headfirst into the same cliffside, the impact sending shockwaves through the mountain and repaying the tyrant in kind. As the rocks tumbled around them, Kakarot charged an energy blast in his free hand. "Take this," he yelled, slamming the energy point blank into Cold's face. The explosion was deafening, and in the split second before the mountain crumbled entirely, Kakarot teleported away, reappearing high in the air. The mountain was reduced to rubble, but King Cold rose from the wreckage, his body bruised, bloodied, and trembling with fury. "You miserable monkey," he roared, his voice hoarse. But before he could finish, Kakarot reappeared behind him once more, driving a powerful punch into the tyrant's kidneys. Cold screamed in agony, his body twisting from the blow. Kakarot didn't let up. He followed with a brutal kick to Cold's broken ribs, the force of the strike snapping the already fractured bones. A sharp gasp escaped Cold as he staggered, his breath now coming in ragged wheezes as a punctured lung made every inhale excruciating. "You're done," Kakarot declared, surging forward. He delivered an uppercut to Cold's solar plexus, forcing what little air remained out of the tyrant's lungs. The changeling doubled over, helpless, but Kakarot wasn't finished. Grabbing Cold by the head, he brought the tyrant's face down hard onto his knee, the impact shattering Cold's nose and sending blood spraying into the air. "Destructo Disc!" Kakarot shouted, summoning a razor-sharp energy disc. The glowing blade of energy spun with deadly precision as it tore through the air toward Cold. The tyrant barely had time to register what was happening before the disc sliced clean through his torso, severing his head and upper body from the rest of his body. Even as Cold's lifeless body began to fall, Kakarot wasn't taking any chances. Cupping his hands at his side, he poured the last of his energy into a final attack. "Kamehameha!" he roared, unleashing the massive wave of energy. The blast engulfed Cold's remains entirely, incinerating them in an instant and ensuring that the tyrant would never rise again. Kakarot descended slowly to the ground, his golden aura fading as his Super Saiyan form dissolved. His hair returned to its usual black, and his expression softened as he surveyed the battlefield. It was over. Both Frieza and King Cold were gone, and for the first time in what felt like forever, there was peace. "Daddy!" Bardock's voice rang out, filled with relief and excitement. The boy bolted toward him, throwing his arms around his father in a bear hug that nearly knocked Kakarot off balance. Kakarot laughed, wrapping his son in a warm embrace. "I'm glad I'm back too," he said, his voice gentle. He placed a hand on Bardock's head, ruffling his hair with a smile. "Now, let's go home." Later that evening, Kakarot and Bulma sat together on the balcony of Capsule Corp, gazing at the stars above. The cool night air was filled with the gentle hum of crickets, and the faint glow of the city lights below cast a warm ambiance around them. "So let me get this straight," Bulma said, her tone a mix of wonder and disbelief. "You used this teleporting technique to get back just in time to stop Frieza and King Cold?" "Yeah," Kakarot replied, leaning back in his chair. "It's called instant transmission. I was on my way back to Earth when I sensed their energy, but they were moving so fast there was no way I could catch up in time. Thankfully, the technique works over really long distances." Bulma chuckled softly, resting her head on his shoulder. "Well, I'm just glad you're back. It was too quiet around here without you." "I'm glad to be back too, darling," Kakarot said, his arm wrapping around her. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, simply enjoying each other's presence. But then, Kakarot's body stiffened, his head turning slightly as his brow furrowed in concentration. Bulma sat up, catching the change in his expression. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice tinged with concern. "I sense something," Kakarot said, his tone serious. "There's someone down in the courtyard." Bulma's eyes widened. "Is it trouble?" she asked. "I don't think so," Kakarot replied, standing and peering out into the darkness below. "Their energy isn't very strong, but I need to check it out." Bulma nodded, though her worry didn't fade. "Be careful," she said softly. Kakarot gave her a reassuring smile before stepping out of the balcony and gliding down into the courtyard. He landed quietly, scanning the area until his eyes caught movement in the bushes. In a flash, he was behind the shadowy figure, startling them into spinning around. The figure gasped, their wide eyes locking onto him. "It's you," the voice, a girl, said, her tone filled with equal parts awe and relief. Kakarot tilted his head. "You know me?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. The girl hesitated before nodding. "Yes, well, I know of you," she said. Kakarot crossed his arms, his gaze sharpening. "Who are you?" he asked. Instead of answering immediately, the girl glanced toward the building. "Can we go inside first?" she asked. "I'd like to talk to Bulma as well." A few minutes later, the three of them were seated in the lounge of Capsule Corp. Bulma entered the room carrying a tray with 3 glasses of juice, setting it down on the coffee table before taking a seat next to Kakarot. The girl sat across from them, her expression serious. She was tall and slender, with long, jet black hair that framed her face. She wore a pair of denim shorts and a Capsule Corp jacket over a plain white t-shirt, the logo faintly visible on her sleeve. "So," Bulma began, handing Kakarot a drink, "who's our visitor?" "We were just getting to that," Kakarot said, leaning forward slightly, his sharp eyes fixed on the girl. "All right, let's hear it. Who are you?" The girl hesitated briefly before speaking. "My name is Celia," she said, "and this may sound strange, but I'm from the future." Bulma and Kakarot exchanged a glance, their expressions more curious than shocked. It wasn't the first time they'd heard of time travel. Kakarot's eyes narrowed slightly. "Celia, that's a Saiyan name." Celia blinked, momentarily thrown off guard. She had expected more disbelief or questions about her claim of being from the future, but instead, he'd picked up on her heritage. "Yes," she said after a moment, nodding. "I am a Saiyan, or at least part Saiyan, and I've come to warn you." "Warn us about what?" Kakarot asked, his body tensing slightly. "In 3 years," Celia began, her voice grim, 5 androids will appear. They will attack the Earth. Bulma's breath caught. "Androids?" she repeated, her voice filled with disbelief. "You're telling me robots are going to destroy the Earth?" Celia nodded, her expression unwavering. "They're not like anything you've faced before. They're incredibly strong. Stronger than anything we could have imagined. When they arrived, they wiped out most of the Z-fighters almost effortlessly. They've been terrorizing the Earth ever since." Kakarot leaned forward, his expression hardening. "What about me?" he asked. "Wasn't I strong enough to stop them?" Celia's face fell slightly, her eyes downcast. "You were our strongest warrior," she admitted. "Even with you, Raditz, and my father as Super Saiyans, it wasn't enough. You all fell in the first days of the battle." Kakarot's jaw clenched at her words, the weight of her warning sinking in. "That's terrible," he said quietly. "So these androids, they're really that powerful?" "Yes," Celia said with a solemn nod, her voice heavy with the weight of her words. "The androids were incredibly strong. After they killed you, they went on an unstoppable rampage, destroying cities and killing people without mercy. Bardock tried to stand against them. He gave it everything he had, even after unlocking his Super Saiyan transformation, but it wasn't enough." Kakarot's fists clenched at his sides as he listened, his expression darkening. "What happened to Bardock?" he asked quietly. "They didn't kill him right away," Celia continued, her tone laced with sorrow. "They thought it would be fun to use him as a toy, someone to fight for their amusement. For years, he endured it, refusing to give up. But in the end, even he fell. That was when," she hesitated, glancing at Bulma before finishing. "That was when Trunks transformed into a Super Saiyan and went after the androids to avenge his older brother." "Trunks?" Bulma repeated, her brow furrowing in confusion. "Oh, right," Celia said, a flicker of realization crossing her face. "Sorry. Trunks is the second son that you and Kakarot will have. He'll be born soon. That's actually one of the reasons I waited to come here. I didn't want to interrupt your reunion, or, well, Trunks' conception." Bulma's face softened with understanding, but curiosity lingered in her eyes. "So," she asked, "what happened to Trunks?" "I don't know," Celia admitted, her voice trembling slightly. "When Bardock fell, Trunks charged off to confront the androids on his own. I tried to stop him, but I wasn't strong enough. My mother never let me train with Bardock and Trunks. She was always so worried about my safety." Bulma leaned forward, her voice careful but direct. "So you took the time machine and came back here to warn us, to stop this future from happening?" "Yes," Celia said firmly. The you from my timeline built a time machine before the androids appeared. You'd been tinkering with it for years. I convinced you to let me use it to come back and try to change things." Kakarot crossed his arms, his golden glow from earlier replaced with a look of deep thought. "Celia," he said, his tone shifting slightly, "if you don't mind me asking, who are your parents?" Celia exhaled slowly, as if she had been waiting for this question. "I figured you'd ask sooner or later," she said with a small smile. "As you've already guessed, I'm part Saiyan, and as you'll soon notice, Chi-Chi and Yamcha had a bad breakup just a few days ago. She's going to come here soon to vent, probably to you, Bulma, and complain about men in general." Bulma's eyes widened slightly, and she glanced at Kakarot, who scratched the back of his head awkwardly. "That sounds like Chi-Chi," he muttered. Celia continued, her expression softening. "Somehow, during that time, my parents meet, and, well, I'm conceived." Kakarot raised an eyebrow, his lips twitching as he put the pieces together. Your father's Vegeta, isn't he?" Celia nodded, her dark eyes locking onto Kakarot's. "Yes, he and my mom eventually find each other, and I just ask one thing. Please don't interfere with how they come together. It's important." Bulma placed a reassuring hand on Celia's shoulder. "Don't worry," she said warmly. "We won't do anything that could put you at risk of not being born." Kakarot gave a nod of agreement. "Yeah, we'll keep quiet. We won't say anything to Vegeta about this until it's time." Celia's lips curved into a grateful smile. "Thank you," she said. "Honestly, I don't think knowing would change much for him. My dad trained constantly anyway. My mom used to say he nearly killed himself trying to keep up with you, Kakarot. I just want you to train harder. Give him something even greater to strive for." Kakarot's face lit up with determination. "Then, we'll start training tomorrow," he said confidently. "Sounds good," Celia replied. Her expression grew serious again. "I have one last request. I want to come back and train with you. I'll return after a year of your time and join your training. That way, I won't interfere with my own birth." Kakarot nodded, his eyes meeting hers. "Okay, we'll see you then," he said. Celia smiled softly, relief evident in her features. "Thank you," she said, her voice quiet but filled with resolve. Kakarot was already up before the sun, the cool morning air sharp against his skin as he tugged on his fresh fighting uniform. It was only 5 in the morning, but lounging around wasn't an option, not with the androids looming 3 years away. The fate of Earth depended on him being ready. His first destination was Bardock's room. Reaching the door, he knocked briskly before calling out, "Son, wake up, time to train." A muffled, groggy voice answered. "What? It's too early. Get up," Kakarot insisted, his voice firm. A few minutes passed before Bardock shuffled out of the room, his hair disheveled and eyes half closed. He yawned, rubbing the sleep from his face as he leaned against the doorframe.
"What's the deal, Dad?" he muttered, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "Can't this wait until a decent hour?" "There's no time to waste," Kakarot replied, his tone urgent. "There's a serious threat coming to Earth in 3 years, and we need to be ready."
That woke Bardock up a little. "A threat?" he repeated, still trying to piece things together. "I'll explain over breakfast," Kakarot said, turning toward the kitchen. "But once we're done eating, we start training. No excuses." Bardock grumbled under his breath, but the determination in his father's voice left no room for argument. He followed reluctantly, knowing there was no getting out of it. Vegeta finished his 1000th push-up, the relentless pull of 150 times Earth's gravity, making every movement feel like a battle. Sweat dripped from his brow as he pushed himself to his feet, refusing to let exhaustion claim him. The thought of Kakarot, that low-class warrior, achieving the legendary Super Saiyan form before him, gnawed at his pride. To make matters worse, even Raditz had managed to ascend. With a sharp growl, Vegeta unleashed a flurry of kicks and punches at the empty air, each strike fueled by his frustration. In his mind, he wasn't just training, he was pummeling Kakarot into the dirt. "This is unacceptable," Vegeta muttered under his breath, his voice filled with venom. A Saiyan prince does not trail behind commoners. For the past 2 months, Vegeta had been holed up in Capsule Corporation's state-of-the-art gravity chamber, pushing his body to its limit. The chamber itself was a gift, or perhaps a taunt, from Kakarot, who'd casually dropped off a new model capable of reaching up to 300 times Earth's gravity. Vegeta scoffed at the memory. "As if I needed his charity," he muttered, wiping his face with the back of his glove. Still, he couldn't deny the chamber's quality. As the prince of all Saiyans, he deserved nothing but the best. And with this new setup, it was only a matter of time before he surpassed both Kakarot and Raditz. He clenched his fists, a determined smirk playing on his lips. Chi-Chi sat at the sleek Capsule Corp dining table, cradling a steaming cup of coffee between her hands. Across from her, Bulma leaned back in her chair, her blue hair framing her face as she sipped her own mug. They'd been spending more time together lately, especially after Chi-Chi caught Yamcha sneaking around with another woman. Having a friend to confide in was comforting, and Bulma, ever the good listener, didn't seem to mind the company. "So," Bulma asked with a mischievous grin, "any new prospects on the horizon?" Chi-Chi's cheeks flushed pink, and she glanced down at her coffee. "I'm not sure I'm ready to move on just yet," she admitted, her voice soft, "but if we're being honest, I think Vegeta's kinda cute." Bulma blinked in surprise. "Really? Vegeta?" She couldn't hide the note of disbelief in her voice. "I always figured he was kind of a, well, you know, a jerk." Chi-Chi laughed lightly, her blush deepening. "Yeah, I know he's got an attitude, but have you seen him? Those muscles? He's like a walking statue. I thought Yamcha was ripped, but Vegeta puts him to shame." Bulma tilted her head thoughtfully. "Well, you're not wrong about the muscles," she admitted. "Kakarot's no slouch in that department either." "You're lucky," Chi-Chi said, glancing up with a small smile. "Having such a great guy." Bulma chuckled, waving her hand dismissively. "Oh, he has his moments, but let's talk more about you. Why Vegeta, of all people? What about one of the other fighters?" Chi-Chi wrinkled her nose. "Raditz? Too much hair. I'm not into the whole long-haired thing. And Nappa? Ugh, he's just old and bald." Bulma burst into giggles. "Okay, yeah, I can't argue with that. Nappa's definitely not a looker." The two women shared a laugh, the conversation flowing easily as they delved into the quirks of the people in their lives. Vegeta strode into the Capsule Corp kitchen, his face set in its usual stoic expression. His muscles were taut and glistening with sweat, evidence of his grueling workout session. His dark eyes flicked briefly to the two women seated at the table, Kakarot's mate, Chi-Chi, and the blue-haired Bulma. They were sipping coffee and chatting quietly, but Vegeta could feel their gazes linger on him as he crossed the room. "Do Earth women do anything besides drink coffee and stare?" he thought irritably, though he noticed the way Chi-Chi quickly stood when he entered. "Can I get you some water?" Chi-Chi offered, holding out a glass filled with ice water. Vegeta didn't reply, but accepted the glass with a short nod. He tilted his head back and drank, the cold liquid sliding down his throat and cutting through the heat of his training session. It was satisfying, but Vegeta didn't waste time lingering on pleasantries. Handing the empty glass back to her, he turned and started toward his quarters, eager for a long shower to wash away the day's efforts. "Can I get you something to eat?" Chi-Chi called after him, her voice polite but hopeful. "That would be fine, woman," Vegeta replied brusquely, not even glancing back as he continued down the hallway. Behind him, Chi-Chi's brow furrowed slightly. "My name is Chi-Chi," she muttered under her breath, watching him disappear around the corner. Bulma raised an eyebrow at her friend.
a knowing smirk tugging at her lip. "You've got your hands full with that one."
Across the compound, Raditz's long hair whipped behind him as he twisted to dodge Nappa's massive fist. The bald Saiyan's punch missed by mere inches, but Raditz wasn't quick enough to avoid the knee that followed. The blow connected hard with his midsection, knocking the air from his lungs and forcing a cough of blood from his mouth. "Nice shot," Raditz admitted with a grimace, stumbling back. "Didn't know you'd mastered Kaioken that fast."
"I've been working on it," Nappa said with a smirk, his hulking frame radiating confidence. "Figured it might catch you off guard." Without waiting for a reply, Nappa closed the gap and delivered a powerful right hook to Raditz's jaw, sending him flying across the gravity chamber. Raditz slammed his boots against the floor, getting to a stop before he hit the wall. Shaking off the impact, he grinned through bloodied lips.
"Not bad," he admitted, "but I'm not down yet." With a burst of speed, Raditz launched himself back at Nappa, fists blazing as the two warriors clashed in the center of the room. The air vibrated with the force of their strikes, though both held back enough to avoid completely destroying their surroundings. The last time they'd gone all out, they'd wrecked the gravity chamber so thoroughly that Bulma had needed an entire week to build a replacement. Still, even at 150 times Earth's gravity, the limitations didn't deter them. Raditz flipped through the air, adjusting his stance as he re-engaged, refusing to let Nappa get the upper hand again.
At the end of a long day, Kakarot and Bardock trudged into the Capsule Corp dining room, the smell of dinner wafting through the air. Bardock was battered and bruised from head to toe, his movements stiff as he collapsed into a chair at the table. Kakarot, by contrast, was barely winded, his powerful frame bearing only a few scuffs. Despite Bardock's progress, the gap between their strengths remained as wide as ever. "How was training?" Bulma asked from the kitchen, peeking out as she set a dish on the counter.
Neither answered right away. They were too busy devouring the spread laid out before them, eating with the kind of speed and fervor that always left Bulma in awe. Bardock managed a reply between mouthfuls, though. "It was all right," he mumbled, shoving another bite into his mouth. Bulma couldn't help but smile at the sight. She'd grown used to the Saiyans' enormous appetites, but recently, she'd noticed her own cravings had increased as well. She rested a hand on her stomach, her thoughts drifting to the tiny Saiyan baby growing inside her. "Must be taking after his father already," she mused. "We're heading outside tomorrow," Kakarot said, his voice carrying easily over the sounds of chewing. "We need more space to really go all out. The gravity room's fine for endurance, but it's too fragile for sparring." Bulma wiped her hands on a towel, walking over to the table with an air of excitement. "I've been working on something that might solve that problem," she said, pulling a small box from the counter. "Since Raditz and Nappa wrecked the last chamber, I thought it might be time for an upgrade." She opened the box to reveal a set of sleek, high-tech equipment, a belt, paired with wrist and ankle bands. "What's that?" Kakarot asked, his eyes wide with curiosity as he leaned closer to the equipment Bulma had revealed. Bulma grinned, clearly proud of her invention. "It's a personal gravity device," she explained, holding up the sleek belt and wristbands. "You wear these, adjust the dial, and it creates a personal gravity field around you. It's like being inside a gravity chamber, but completely portable." Kakarot's face lit up. "That's amazing! So we can train anywhere now?" "Exactly," Bulma replied with a nod. "You're no longer limited to the chamber, though of course, you'll still need to be careful where you're training. The field will affect you, but it won't protect the environment around you from any collateral damage." Bardock studied the devices thoughtfully, picking up one of the wristbands. "How durable are these?" he asked, turning it over in his hands. "I made them from the strongest metals I could get my hands on," Bulma said confidently. "They'll withstand a lot of abuse. Just try not to let any energy blasts hit them directly. Too much force in the wrong place could compromise the circuitry." "This is incredible," Kakarot said, testing the weight of the belt. "How high does it go? Can it handle 200 times Earth's gravity?" Bulma shook her head. "Not yet. These are prototypes, so they're capped at 100 times Earth's gravity for now. But I'm already working on improving the technology. Once I refine the miniaturization process, I'm sure I'll be able to push them much higher." "That's still amazing," Bardock said, a grin breaking across his face. "Thanks, Mom." Bulma's expression softened, her proud smirk giving way to a more tender smile. "Anything to keep my baby safe from the androids," she thought, though she didn't say it out loud.
In the distant future, Celia stepped out of the cramped cockpit of her time machine, the familiar dimness of the underground bunker greeting her. The hum of machinery and muffled voices from nearby chambers filled the air. Her mission to the past had gone as planned, but unease still gnawed at her. No matter how much she tried to reassure herself, she couldn't shake the feeling that it might not have been enough. She walked through the bunker's narrow corridors until she reached the main chamber. There, she saw an older Bulma, crouched beside a wounded survivor, carefully bandaging his arm. Despite the years that had passed, Bulma's determined spirit shone through. Her hair was streaked with gray, and lines of worry marked her face, but she still carried the same grace and energy Celia remembered. Bulma glanced up, her eyes brightening. "Celia, you're back," she said, relief in her voice. "How'd it go?" "As well as I could have hoped," Celia replied, setting down her belonging. "I talked to you and Kakarot in the past, told them everything about the androids. I think they'll take the threat seriously and train as hard as they can." She hesitated, her brow furrowing. "But I don't know if it'll be enough." Bulma stood and brushed her hands off on her pants. "There's no way to know for sure," she admitted, her tone gentle. "But it was worth a try."
Celia frowned. "Shouldn't things here change if we altered the past?" Bulma shook her head slowly. "It doesn't work like that. That's why we didn't use the time machine sooner. When you went back, the timeline split the moment you made a change. That version of the past is no longer connected to our present. Whatever happens there won't affect us here." Celia's shoulders sagged. "Then why did you let me go back at all?" Bulma placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Because," she said softly, "even if it doesn't save our time, it might save someone else's. At least one version of our world can be spared this nightmare." Celia took a deep breath, her jaw tightening as she absorbed Bulma's words. "I get it," she said finally, "but it's hard to think about everything staying the same here, no matter what I do." "I know," Bulma said quietly. "Believe me, I know." Celia looked around the room, her thoughts briefly drifting to their missing allies. "Have you heard anything about Trunks?" Bulma sighed, crossing her arms. "The androids worked him over pretty badly. He barely made it back here after you left, but he's alive, recovering in the medbay." Relief flickered in Celia's eyes. "That's good, at least. I don't know what I'd do if we lost him too." She turned back to Bulma, her expression hardening with determination. "I'm going back again," she declared, her voice steady. "What?" Bulma asked, her voice laced with both confusion and worry. "I'm going back," Celia repeated firmly. "I'm going to train with the others to fight the androids. If I can spend a few years training in the past, I think I can make a real difference, and it'll make me stronger." Bulma frowned, her hands gripping the edge of the table tightly. "What if you don't make it?" she asked, her voice softening. "What if you don't come back?" Celia looked down for a moment before answering, her tone unwavering. "It won't matter then," she said plainly. "We don't have much hope of beating the androids here anyway, but if I can help in the past, at least one timeline can be saved." Before Bulma could respond, a voice rang out from the hallway. "I'm going with you." Celia and Bulma both turned toward the doorway to see a tall, broad-shouldered young man stepping into the room. He looked about 18, dressed in jeans and a capsule corp jacket over a black t-shirt. A sword strapped to his back glinted faintly under the dim bunker lights. His purple hair stood in spiky disarray, a trait he'd inherited from his father. "Trunks!" Celia gasped, running toward him. She threw her arms around him in a tight embrace. "I thought you were a goner." Trunks chuckled softly, patting her back. "Come on," he said, though his voice carried a note of fatigue. "Bardock trained me better than that." Despite his confident words, he couldn't deny to himself that the androids had come dangerously close to finishing him off. If they hadn't been toying with him, he wouldn't be standing here. Pulling back from the hug, Trunks looked at Celia seriously. "So you're going to the past?" he asked. Celia nodded. "Yeah. I'm going to train with my father, your father, and your brother for 2 years. I want to be ready to help them fight the androids in the past." Trunks nodded slowly. "I gathered as much from what you were saying." He folded his arms across his chest. "And I'm going with you." "One problem," Bulma interjected, stepping between them. "The time machine only has one seat." Trunks smirked slightly. "I think we can squeeze in there, Mom." Celia gave him a sly smile. "I don't mind the closeness," she teased. "It's not like we haven't been close before." She leaned in and gave him a quick peck on the lips, her tone light despite the heavy decision ahead. Bulma raised an eyebrow but chose not to comment, sighing instead. Trunks turned to Celia, determination shining in his eyes. "We'll leave in the morning." The time machine shimmered into existence, materializing in the courtyard of Capsule Corp with a faint hum. The lush greenery, bright flowers, and pristine buildings stood in stark contrast to the desolate wasteland Celia and Trunks had left behind. It had been a year since Celia's first trip to the past, at least for the others. For her and Trunks, only a day had passed since they'd departed. Trunks stepped out first, taking in the vibrant scene around him, the clear blue sky, the warm sun,
and the lively buzz of birds made him pause. "It's so beautiful here," he said, his voice tinged with awe.
Celia followed, nodding in agreement. "Yeah," she said softly, her eyes scanning the untouched landscape. The last time she'd arrived, it had been the middle of the night, and she hadn't been able to take in the full view. Now, seeing everything bathed in sunlight, it was overwhelming how alive and intact this world was.
"Welcome back," a familiar voice greeted them.
Celia turned to see Kakarot standing in the courtyard, his arms folded and a warm smile on his face. He was dressed in his usual fighting uniform, but now he also wore the personal gravity belt and bands Bulma had given him. "Hi," Celia said, stepping forward. "I'd like you to meet your youngest son, Trunks." Kakarot's smile widened, and he let out a soft chuckle. "I've met him before," he joked lightly, "when he was just a baby." Trunks stepped forward, extending his hand. Kakarot took it, but immediately pulled him into a firm hug instead. Trunks stiffened at first, but relaxed, caught off guard by the warmth of the gesture. "I'm proud of you," Kakarot said, his voice steady but kind. He pulled back, gripping Trunks' shoulders and looking him in the eye. "You've grown into a fine young man." "Thanks, father," Trunks said, a little awkwardly. Standing face to face with Kakarot felt surreal. His mother had told him so much about his father, his strength, his kindness, his unwavering resolve, but actually meeting him was something else entirely. Everything she'd described was spot on. "I decided to come and help as much as I could," Trunks added, trying to hide his nervousness. Kakarot gave him a warm smile. "I'm glad to see you. From the way Celia talked, I was worried you might have been in trouble."
Trunks blushed, scratching the back of his head. "Yeah, well, I kinda lost it when Bardock died. I tried to take on the androids myself. It didn't go so well." He let out a humorless laugh. "Luckily, they were in a good mood and let me live. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here."
Kakarot's smile softened. He placed a hand on Trunks' shoulder. "What's important is that you're here now. We'll start training in the morning, but for now, let's catch up and get some food. You must be starving." Elsewhere in Capsule Corp, Vegeta stepped out of the gravity chamber, his body drenched in sweat and his muscles aching from hours of relentless training. He had practically lived in the chamber for the past year, pushing himself harder and harder in his effort to catch up to Kakarot and Raditz. The thought of those two achieving the legendary Super Saiyan form before him was a constant thorn in his pride. How could they ascend while I, the Prince of all Saiyans, still remained stuck? Vegeta seethed inwardly. Worse, no matter how hard he trained, it felt like his progress was slowing. He made his way toward the showers, eager to clean up and reset his focus, but his path was blocked by an all too familiar voice. "Vegeta!" Chi-Chi called, stepping into the hallway. "What is it, woman?" Vegeta replied, his tone sharp but not entirely hostile. While he found Earthwomen generally irritating, Chi-Chi wasn't entirely unpleasant, especially when she wasn't interrupting his training. "Kakarot wants to see you about something," she said simply, and lunches. Vegeta paused, his scowl softening slightly at the mention of food. Despite himself, he had to admit it was convenient having someone around who prepared meals between his intense training sessions.
"Fine," he said, giving a curt nod. "The shower can wait." He followed Chi-Chi to the kitchen, where a spread of food was already set out on the table. Without hesitation, Vegeta sat down and began eating, his appetite as fierce as ever. Chi-Chi soon returned with their infant daughter, cradling the tiny girl in one arm while preparing a bottle with her free hand. Once ready, she sat across from Vegeta and began feeding the hungry Saiyan baby.
As he tore into his meal, Vegeta glanced up. "What does Kakarot want?" he asked between bites. "Bulma didn't say," Chi-Chi replied. "She just mentioned that it's something important, something that concerns all of us." Vegeta frowned, his chewing slowing as he processed her words. He wasn't fond of Kakarot, not just because it stung his pride to admit that the other Saiyan was stronger than him, but because Kakarot's easygoing nature grated on his nerves. However, Vegeta also knew that Kakarot wasn't one to raise the alarm without good reason. "Fine," Vegeta said finally. "I'll see him after my shower." Chi-Chi smiled faintly, her attention returning to the infant in her arms. "Okay, dear," she said, her tone light but calm. Vegeta returned to his food, his mind already turning over what this meeting could mean. Kakarot leaned back against the courtyard wall, his arms crossed and his face calm. He had been relaxing, enjoying the quiet moment, but his expression changed slightly when he noticed Vegeta descending from the sky. The Saiyan Prince landed with precision, his stance rigid and his scowl firmly in place. "Hey Vegeta," Kakarot greeted, his tone friendly but direct. "What do you want?" Vegeta snapped, wasting no time on pleasantries. "Well," Kakarot began, deciding to get straight to the point. There's a serious threat coming in 2 years. Vegeta raised an eyebrow, his tone cutting. What threat? 5 incredibly strong androids, Kakarot replied. They'll attack Earth, and if we're not ready, they'll destroy everything, Vegeta scoffed, folding his arms. Why don't you and your Super Saiyan brother handle it yourselves? His words dripped with venom. We're not strong enough, Kakarot said, simply, his face serious. That response made Vegeta pause. It wasn't like Kakarot to admit weakness, and the gravity in his tone couldn't be ignored. For a moment, Vegeta just stared at him, his pride battling with the realization that this wasn't just a bluff. And what do you expect me to do about it? Vegeta asked, his frustration bleeding into his voice. You need to become a Super Saiyan, Kakarot said. Vegeta's jaw tightened. You think I haven't been trying to do that already? There's more to it than just training in the gravity room, Kakarot explained. You've been pushing your body to the limit, but I'll bet you've noticed something. Your strength isn't increasing anymore. Vegeta's silence was all the confirmation Kakarot needed. The prince didn't like to admit weakness, but the truth was undeniable. Lately, no matter how hard he trained, his power had plateaued. You need to break through, Kakarot said. Your body's ready for the transformation, but strength alone won't get you there. When I transformed, it wasn't just because I was angry at Frieza for killing my son. It was because I needed to get stronger. If I didn't, we all would have died. I was there, Vegeta snapped, his voice rising. You don't need to lecture me about Frieza. Kakarot held up a hand to calm him. That's not my point. What I'm saying is that you're training alone. It won't create the need for you to transform. Vegeta's glare darkened. So what's your point, Kakarot? Kakarot didn't answer immediately. Instead, his black hair shimmered, turning into golden spikes as he ascended into his Super Saiyan form. Without warning, he darted forward, his knee smashing into Vegeta's face with blinding speed. The force sent Vegeta flying backward, his body flipping through the air. What's the idea? Vegeta snarled, rubbing his jaw as he steadied himself in midair. Kakarot smirked faintly. Guess I forgot to explain. You're going to become a Super Saiyan or die trying. Before Vegeta could respond, Kakarot was on him again. His fist shot forward, burying itself into Vegeta's stomach with devastating power. Vegeta coughed violently, spitting up blood as he doubled over in pain. Kakarot, you fool! Vegeta managed to shout, but his words were cut off by Kakarot's roundhouse kick. The blow connected with his arms as he tried to block, but the force was overwhelming. It sent Vegeta flying across the rocky landscape, his body digging a deep trench into the ground. Hovering in the air, Kakarot held his hand out, a ball of glowing energy forming in his palm. This blast is strong enough to kill you, he said, his tone sharp and unyielding. You better transform if you want to live. Vegeta's vision blurred as Kakarot released the energy blast, the glowing sphere racing toward him like a meteor. He staggered to his feet, disoriented and battered. Dodging wasn't an option. He was too slow in his current state. His instincts, honed by years of battle, told him this wasn't a bluff. Kakarot wasn't holding back. If he couldn't counter this, it was over. He gritted his teeth and raised his hands, palms forward, bracing for impact. The blast slammed into him with a force that felt like the weight of an entire planet. His arms screamed in protest, the energy scorching his palms and numbing his muscles. The sheer power of the attack drove him backward, his boots digging trenches into the ground. The dirt and rock beneath him crumbled as he struggled to hold his position, his body trembling under the strain. This isn't enough, Vegeta thought desperately. His mind raced as the blast pushed him closer to the edge. He needed more power, far more power if he wanted to survive. He considered a technique he'd seen Kakarot and the humans use before, a way to temporarily boost power by borrowing energy from others. But something about it had always seemed wrong. That power wouldn't truly be his. Vegeta had always prided himself on his strength being his own, but pride was meaningless if he was dead. Gritting his teeth, Vegeta thought back to the years he'd spent on the edge of despair. There had been times, after the destruction of his planet, when he'd wanted to die. Times when survival felt like an empty chore. He'd worn his cold, unfeeling demeanor like armor, a shield to get through the endless missions and battles. But now he had something to live for. Images flashed through his mind. His mate, her unwavering support, the daughter he hadn't thought he could care for, but now meant everything. He wasn't going to let them down. Not now. Not ever. With a guttural roar, Vegeta threw everything he had into the fight. His muscles strained, his energy surged, and he felt something inside him crack, then shatter. Power flooded through him, fierce and unrelenting like a dam breaking and releasing a raging river. His aura exploded outward, a golden light engulfing him as his hair stood on end and shifted to a brilliant gold. The energy blast that had been driving him back slowed, then reversed. With a final push, Vegeta hurled the blast skyward, where it detonated harmlessly in the clouds. Kakarot floated above, watching with a grin. "I knew you could do it," he said, his voice filled with pride. Vegeta didn't waste words. He phased in front of Kakarot in an instant, his fist connecting solidly with the taller Saiyan's jaw. The punch barely phased Kakarot, but it made its point. "That's for trying to kill me," Vegeta said, his tone icy but his breathing ragged. "You're welcome," Kakarot replied with a grin, completely unbothered. Vegeta grunted, crossing his arms. Despite himself, he felt a flicker of satisfaction. He had achieved what he'd been chasing for so long, Super Saiyan, but he wasn't about to thank a low-class warrior for it. "I've got another surprise for you," Kakarot said, breaking into Vegeta's thoughts. Before Vegeta could respond, Kakarot disappeared, his instant transmission technique leaving nothing but a faint shimmer in the air. He reappeared seconds later with someone by his side, a young girl, her dark eyes wide as she looked up at Vegeta. Kakarot smiled. "Vegeta, I'd like you to meet Celia." The name struck Vegeta like a bolt of lightning. He blinked, his golden aura flickering as he took in the sight of her. Of course, he recognized the name instantly. He was the one who had insisted on it. After all, if his daughter was going to be a princess, she needed a true Saiyan name, even if she was half human. "Hi, father," Celia said, her voice steady but carrying a warmth that took Vegeta by surprise. He stared at her, the disbelief clear on his face. "How?" was all he managed to say, his sharp mind reeling. "I'm from the future," Celia explained calmly, her expression unwavering. "I came back to help with the android threat." Suddenly, everything clicked in Vegeta's mind. That's how Kakarot knew about the impending danger. Of course, it all made sense now. "Don't worry," Vegeta said, his confidence surging as his golden aura flickered around him. "I won't let the androids hurt my family. And now that I've become a Super Saiyan, those metallic pests will be nothing but scrap." Celia frowned slightly. "You were a Super Saiyan in my time too," she said. "The androids still killed you, Kakarot, and Raditz." Vegeta froze for a moment, processing her words. Then he laughed, his signature cocky smirk returning. "I guess I'll just have to make sure that doesn't happen this time," he said. "I want to train with you, father," Celia said, her tone both respectful and determined. "I promise I won't slow you down." Vegeta studied her for a moment, his sharp eyes narrowing as he assessed her energy. She wasn't particularly strong compared to him, but there was potential there, raw, untapped power waiting to be developed. He'd sensed it even when she was born, her energy higher than most half-Saiyans. And now, standing before him, she was already stronger than he had been at her age. "What training have you had?" he asked, crossing his arms. "Not much," Celia admitted, looking slightly embarrassed. "After you were killed by the androids, Mom didn't want me to train. She was scared they'd come for me too." Vegeta paused, his expression hardening. The thought of his daughter being vulnerable, unable to defend herself, didn't sit well with him. He didn't want her fighting machines built to kill, but he wanted even less for her to grow up weak and unprepared. "All right," Vegeta said finally. "We'll start training tomorrow." His smirk returned. "By now, your mother will have dinner ready." Celia's face brightened, but Vegeta's grin wasn't just for her. After the intense day he'd had, he figured he'd earned a break, and it wouldn't hurt to spend some time getting to know his future daughter. Out in the woods, Bardock's fists flew through the air, each punch sharper and faster than the last. His gravity belt was dialed up to 200 times Earth's gravity, every move an exercise in endurance and strength. Sweat poured down his face as he pushed himself, determination etched into his features. For the past year, Bardock had thrown himself into training, chasing the elusive Super Saiyan transformation his father said he was close to achieving. But close wasn't good enough. A soft rush of displaced air signaled Kakarot's arrival. The older warrior appeared a few feet away, arms crossed, as he watched his son's relentless practice. Bardock stopped mid-punch, turning to acknowledge him. "How'd it go with Vegeta?" he asked, panting slightly from the exertion. "Well," Kakarot said, a small grin tugging at his lips. "He survived, and he transformed." "That's good," Bardock said, nodding approvingly. "Too bad it didn't work when you tried it on me." Kakarot sighed. "I just couldn't make a blast powerful enough to push you to your limit," he admitted. "You've mastered the Kaioken, so even the one I used on Vegeta wouldn't have been enough. You'd have deflected it easily." "Then why not try a stronger one?" Bardock complained, frustration creeping into his voice.
Son, Kakarot said, his voice gentle but firm. We've been over this. As much as I want you to become a Super Saiyan, I don't want to risk seriously hurting you. If I unleashed something that strong, and you couldn't block it, he trailed off, shaking his head. I might not be able to stop it in time. But Dad, Bardock pressed, his fists clenching at his sides. I need to become a Super Saiyan if I'm going to help fight the androids. There are 5 of them. You, Vegeta, and Raditz won't be enough. Kakarot sighed again, his expression darkening slightly. I know, he admitted. I've already started to feel like I've hit a wall in my own training. Bardock frowned. What do you mean? He asked. Kakarot stood quietly for a moment, his golden hair shimmering as he maintained his Super Saiyan form. His hands were relaxed at his sides, though his brow furrowed slightly in thought. Well, he began, breaking the silence. As hard as I've been training, I haven't gotten much stronger. Bardock's eyes widened slightly. But you're the strongest in the universe, he said, his voice tinged with disbelief. Maybe it's because you don't have a real challenge to fight. That could be it, Kakarot admitted, but it doesn't change the fact that I need to be stronger when the androids arrive. What we're up against, it's not going to be easy. You can't do this alone, Dad, Bardock said, stepping closer. His voice was firm, but there was an edge of urgency to it. I know you want to protect me, but I can help. I'm not a kid anymore. Kakarot sighed, a small smile softening his expression. I know, son, he said gently. You're strong, and I'm proud of how far you've come. At least this time, though, we'll have Trunks to help us too. Bardock nodded, his determination growing. That gives us 4 Super Saiyans, but he hesitated for a moment before continuing. We'll need a 5th to take on the androids. With how strong they are, it won't be enough otherwise. Kakarot chuckled softly, rubbing the back of his neck. All right, I get it, he said. You're not gonna let this go, are you? I'll try again to push you to become a Super Saiyan. Thanks, Dad, Bardock said, a grin spreading across his face. Without wasting a second, he ran a short distance away, planting his feet firmly on the ground. Turning back, he raised his hands and steadied himself. I'm ready. Kakarot stepped forward, the golden aura around him flaring brighter as he summoned energy into his hands. The blast he began to form was massive, far larger than the one he'd used on Vegeta earlier. He knew this one had to be stronger, strong enough to push Bardock past his limit. With a grunt, Kakarot hurled the glowing orb of energy forward. It streaked across the distance between them, obliterating trees and foliage in its path, a streak of golden destruction. Bardock braced himself, his hands meeting the blast as his aura flared red with the power of Kaioken. The impact was immense, the force of the blast slamming into Bardock like a tidal wave. His boots dug deep into the ground, creating trenches as he slid back under the pressure. Come on, Bardock shouted, gritting his teeth as he pushed against the attack. The power of Kaioken surged through him, increasing to X30 as he tried to hold his ground. But it wasn't enough. The blast continued to drive him back, unrelenting in its intensity. Sweat poured down Bardock's face as he pushed harder, his mind racing. If I can't stop this, what happens when the androids come? He thought of the devastation they would bring, the lives they would destroy. His mind flashed to Trunks, the hardness in his future brother's eyes. It was the look of someone who had witnessed too much death. I can't let that happen to him. Trunks deserves a world where he can just be a kid. I have to be stronger for him, for everyone. Bardock's red aura began to shimmer, faint streaks of gold flickering at the edges. His teeth clenched as his muscles tensed, every ounce of energy being pushed to its limits. His hair began to shift, flashing between its natural blue-black hue and brilliant gold. Come on, he shouted again, his voice raw with effort. With one final surge, Bardock's hair exploded into a permanent golden glow, and his eyes turned turquoise. His red aura shifted completely, now a bright golden flame surrounding him. He had done it. He was a Super Saiyan. But the battle wasn't over. Even with his newfound strength, the blast was still pushing him back. Kakarot had made it strong enough to challenge him, and it wasn't about to be overpowered easily. Bardock's eyes narrowed, his determination flaring alongside his energy. He pushed back against the blast with everything he had, his hands trembling under the strain, realizing brute force wasn't enough. Bardock gathered his energy into his palms and released his own attack. The golden beam shot forward, colliding with Kakarot's blast in a dazzling explosion of light and power. The explosion roared through the forest, flattening trees and leaving a massive crater that stretched for miles. Smoke billowed into the air, obscuring the battlefield in a haze of gray. Kakarot floated above the destruction, his golden aura flickering faintly as he scanned the ground below. As the smoke cleared, his eyes landed on Bardock, who stood at the epicenter of the devastation. Though battered and bruised, the young Saiyan managed to lift his hand, offering a thumbs up to his father before his body gave out. He collapsed to the ground, unconscious, his golden hair fading back to its natural blue-black hue.
Kakarot descended quickly, landing beside his son. A small smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. "You did it, Bardock," he said quietly. "You've come so far." He lifted the boy gently, cradling him in his arms. "Rest up, you've earned it." Celia stretched lazily as the alarm clock's beeping stirred her from sleep. For a moment, she lay in bed, savoring the silence. It felt strange, peaceful even, to sleep without the ever-present fear of an android attack. In her future, the bunkers were hidden and secure, but there was always a lingering tension, a sense that discovery was only a matter of time. The smell of breakfast wafted into her room, breaking her train of thought. In a flash, she was out of bed and in the kitchen, where she wasted no time devouring a plate of food. Chi-Chi glanced over from the stove, shaking her head with a small smile. "That'll take some getting used to," she said, watching Celia wolf down her meal with the ferocity typical of a Saiyan. "Sorry," Celia mumbled around a mouthful of food. She swallowed quickly and added, "It's just been a while since I've had anything this good. In the future, food like this is hard to come by." Chi-Chi's expression softened. "It's okay, darling," she said gently. "I can only imagine how hard things must have been for you." Celia paused, glancing up at her mother, or rather, the younger version of her mother. It was surreal seeing her this way, so full of life and energy. The Chi-Chi she knew in her own time was worn down, aged far beyond her years by loss and the constant threat of the androids. "Where's father?" Celia asked, breaking the momentary silence. "Oh, the usual," Chi-Chi replied with a shrug. "He ate breakfast faster than you and ran off to train." Celia frowned. "He was supposed to train me today?" Chi-Chi laughed lightly. "He always leaves early," she said. "Don't worry about it, though. Maybe I can show you a thing or two. I might not be as strong as you, Saiyans, but I know my way around a fight."
Celia's jaw dropped in surprise. Was this the same woman who raised me? She wondered. Her future mother had been adamant about forbidding her from training, doing everything in her power to keep her away from combat. Yet here she was, casually offering to spar. "Sure, that'd be great," Celia said, trying to hide her amazement. A few hours later, Celia and Chi-Chi stood in a grassy field, not far from the house. The air was crisp, and the sun shone brightly overhead, bathing the landscape in warmth. "I've always liked training outside," Chi-Chi said, as she stretched her arms. "I don't know why your father insists on spending so much time in that gravity room. Sometimes, you just have to enjoy the fresh air while you can." Celia chuckled. "I guess you have a point," she said. Her eyes wandered to a nearby bouncer, where her younger self sat, babbling and kicking her tiny feet in the sunlight. It was still strange seeing herself as a baby, but she knew she'd get used to it eventually. She had 2 years in this timeline to prepare for the androids. Her mother's advice echoed in her mind. Maybe she should enjoy this peaceful time, at least a little. But training came first. Reaching into the bag she'd brought along, Celia pulled out the gravity belt Bulma had given her. The sleek device gleamed in the sunlight as she buckled it around her waist. With a press of a button, her personal gravity field activated, increasing to 20 times Earth's gravity. Her knees buckled slightly as the weight pressed down on her, but she adjusted quickly, straightening up with a determined smile. "All right, Mom," she said, her voice steady. "Show me what you've got." Celia adjusted the gravity belt at her waist, feeling the increased pressure settle over her body. She stretched her arms, getting used to the added weight. Chi-Chi, standing nearby, eyed the device curiously. "What's that?" Chi-Chi asked, gesturing to the sleek belt. "Oh, this?" Celia said, glancing down. "It's something Bulma made. It lets the wearer increase the gravity around them, makes training a lot tougher." Chi-Chi tilted her head, clearly impressed. "That's pretty neat. I take it your father doesn't know about it? If he did, I'm sure he'd already have one." Celia laughed, imagining it. "Yeah, but he'd probably try to combine it with the gravity room and end up overdoing it." Chi-Chi chuckled along with her. "That does sound like Vegeta," she said, shaking her head. "But even with all his faults, I do love him." Her tone softened for a moment before her expression turned playful. "Speaking of love, do you have any prospect?" Celia froze, her cheeks heating up as she tried and utterly failed to keep her blush from showing. She glanced away, but Chi-Chi had already caught it. "Who is he?" Chi-Chi teased, a knowing smile spreading across her face. "I know that look." "Promise you won't tell father?" Celia asked, her voice low, almost conspiratorial. "This is girl talk," Chi-Chi said with a wink, "and the first rule of girl talk
is we don't talk about it to men. Celia hesitated, but then sighed. She was still getting used to this relaxed, open version of her mother. In her own timeline, Chi-Chi had always been focused on survival, not gossip or playful conversations. "All right," she said, her voice soft. "His name is Trunks."
Chi-Chi's eyebrows rose slightly. "And what does this Trunks do for a living?" "He's a fighter," Celia replied. "With the androids running rampant, that's about the only option left."
"I see," Chi-Chi said thoughtfully, nodding. "I can understand why you wouldn't want your father to know. I can already imagine him challenging this Trunks to a fight." Celia sighed again, shaking her head. "Yeah, that would be awkward." She didn't doubt Trunks could handle her father in a fight, but the situation would still be tense. Another thought crossed her mind. If they managed to defeat the androids and restore their timeline, she might not even have to explain any of this to Vegeta. Shaking off the thought, Celia shifted into a fighting stance. "Speaking of fighting, didn't we come here to spar?" "We did," Chi-Chi said, grinning as she mirrored her daughter's stance. "Let's see what you've got." Meanwhile, Krillin touched down on Master Roshi's island, scanning the familiar surroundings. Yamcha was on the beach, running through basic martial arts stances, while Roshi lounged in a chair nearby, predictably engrossed in one of his magazines. "Hey guys," Krillin called out as he landed. "Krillin," Yamcha said, pausing mid-stance to wave. "Glad you're here. I was just doing a warm-up. I could use a sparring partner if I'm going to stand a chance against the androids." Krillin smiled, but shook his head. "Actually, I've got a plan for that," he said. "Are Tien and Chieyatsu coming?"
"Yeah," Yamcha replied, grabbing a towel to wipe his face. "They should be here soon. But why'd you insist on Chieyatsu coming? He hasn't really fought much since the old tournament days." Krillin's grin widened. "Well, I've been working on a new technique," he said. "It's something I picked up from King Kai after, well, the last time I was killed by Frieza." "What kind of technique?" Yamcha asked. His curiosity piqued. "Fusion," Krillin replied, the word hanging in the air. "Fusion?" Yamcha repeated, confused. "You mean like what Piccolo did on Namek?" "Sort of," Krillin said. "It has a similar effect on power, but this version only lasts for 30 minutes. It's something I learned from the Metamoran people."
Yamcha's eyes lit up. "So, if Tien and I fused, and you and Chieyatsu fused, you think we'd be strong enough to take on the androids?" Krillin shrugged. "I don't know for sure," he admitted, "but the Metamoran people got insanely strong using this technique. It might give us the edge we need." Yamcha nodded, his confidence building. "Sounds great. Those androids won't know what hit them. Let's just hope Tien and Chieyatsu are up for it," Krillin said, looking toward the horizon. "We've got work to do." 2 years later, Kakarot adjusted the sash of his Jai, tightening it securely around his waist. His gaze shifted toward the window, where the early morning sun cast long shadows over the horizon. Today was the day. The androids were coming. After 2 grueling years of training, he could only hope they had done enough to prepare for the battle ahead. "Bardock, Trunks," he called, his voice firm yet calm. "It's time to go. The androids should show up in a few hours." Bardock stretched his arms lazily, leaning against the doorframe. "What's the rush, Dad?" he asked with a grin. "You've got instant transmission. We could be there in a second."
"Besides," Bulma added, stepping into the room with a teasing smile, "I won't have my boys fighting the androids on an empty stomach." At the mention of food, Kakarot's resolve wavered. His stomach growled, as if in agreement. "I guess we have a little time," he conceded with a sheepish laugh.
In another part of Capsule Corp, Chi-Chi set plates of breakfast on the table, barely able to keep up with the voracious appetites of Vegeta and Celia. They devoured the food as fast as she could prepare it, the dishes piling up in the sink like a culinary battlefield. Though she put on a strong front, Chi-Chi's heart was heavy. Today, her husband and daughter would face the androids, and while she knew how powerful they were, it didn't make the fear go away. She could only hope their training had made them strong enough. "Mom? Dad?" Celia said suddenly, setting her fork down. Her tone was nervous yet resolute. "What is it, honey?" Chi-Chi asked, glancing over as Vegeta continued eating, seemingly oblivious to his daughter's words. Celia hesitated, fidgeting slightly. She'd been dreading this moment for weeks, but now there was no time left to stall. She had to tell them. "I'm not going to fight the androids with you," she said finally. Chi-Chi blinked, her brow furrowing. "What? But you've trained so hard, darling." Vegeta snorted, not even looking up from his plate. "There won't be any left after I've had my turn with them anyway," he said, shoving another mouthful of food into his mouth. Celia ignored her father's comment and cleared her throat, her hands tightening into fists on the table. "Well," she began hesitantly. Then, with a deep breath, she blurted it out. "I'm pregnant." The sound of Vegeta spitting his food across the table was almost comical, if not for the murderous glare that followed. He clenched his fists, his knuckles white. "Who?" he growled. The single word carried all the menace of a royal decree. Celia held his gaze, unflinching. She knew exactly what he meant. His name is Trunks, she said evenly. He's Kakarot's second son. He came back from the future with me to help fight the androids. Vegeta's face darkened. His aura flared faintly, making the silverware on the table rattle. He's dead, he declared, his tone ice cold. Now, dear, Chi-Chi interrupted, her voice calm but firm as she placed a hand on her husband's shoulder. Don't go overboard. I've talked with Celia a lot over the past 2 years, and you need to let her make her own decisions. She's a grown woman. I'm not going to kill her, Vegeta said, his teeth gritted. Just a little punk who dared touch my little girl? Celia rolled her eyes, but kept her composure. I'll have you know, I'm 20 years old, she said, her tone unwavering. I'm not exactly a little, and Trunks has been there for me through everything. We love each other. Vegeta's fiery retort died on his lips as he met his daughter's gaze. Her words carried a gravity that cut through his bluster. For all his pride and ferocity, Vegeta couldn't deny the strength of her conviction. He let out a long, slow breath, his fists unclenching. All right, he said begrudgingly. I won't kill him, but I'll make him wish he were dead. After the androids, Chi-Chi reminded him sharply, giving him a warning look. She knew her husband too well. He wouldn't actually hurt Trunks, but the last thing they needed was a fight breaking out between 2 Super Saiyans before the real battle. Vegeta grunted in acknowledgement. After the androids, he promised, though the faint smirk on his face hinted that Trunks wouldn't get off too easily. Celia sighed in relief, her lips twitching into a small smile, despite herself. Thanks, Dad, she said softly. Kakarot, Bardock, and Trunks touched down on Amembo Island, the wind whipping through their hair as they stood atop a cliff, overlooking the city below. The distant sound of waves crashing against the rocky shoreline was drowned out by the tension in the air. In our time, they showed up here, Trunks said, his voice steady, but his gaze distant, as if reliving the horrors he had faced. Kakarot nodded, his eyes scanning the horizon. The others should be here soon, he said. This time, the androids will have to face all of us at once. They won't know what hit them, a voice called out from behind. Did we miss anything? Kakarot turned to see Krillin, Yamcha, Tien, and Chiaotzu, landing gracefully nearby. Not yet, Bardock replied, cracking his knuckles. We just got here ourselves. There's Raditz and Nappa, Trunks said, pointing toward the sky. The 2 Saiyans were descending rapidly, their powerful auras leaving faint trails behind them. Now we're just waiting for Piccolo, Vegeta, and Celia, Kakarot said, folding his arms. I'm here. Piccolo's voice rang out from behind them. The Namekian had arrived as silently as ever, his sudden appearance startling even the seasoned fighters. Guys, Trunks began, his tone lowering. Celia won't be coming. Please don't mention it in front of Vegeta. He might flip. Kakarot frowned. What happened? He asked, his voice filled with concern. Though he knew he couldn't change the hardships of the other timeline, it still pained him to think of what his youngest son and Celia had endured. Before Trunks could answer, a sharp voice cut through the conversation. He contaminated my daughter. That's what happened, Vegeta said coldly, landing a few feet away and dusting off his gloves. His piercing glare was directed squarely at Trunks. Unlike the others, who wore fighting GIs or casual uniforms, Vegeta was clad in traditional Saiyan battle armor, his royal pride evident in his stance. We'll have a little talk when this is all over, he growled at Trunks. Trunks stiffened under Vegeta's gaze, but said nothing, his jaw tightening. Before the tension could boil over, a strange voice echoed from behind the group. Well, well, what have we here? It drawled. It seems all of my enemies have conveniently gathered in one place for me to destroy at once. The Z-Warriors turned in unison to face the source of the voice. An old man with long white hair, a thick mustache, and cold, calculating eyes stood before them. He wore an orange shirt beneath a black vest and pants, and a matching hat with the red ribbon army logo embroidered on it. Nice to see you, Dr. Giro, Trunks said dryly, stepping forward. We've been expecting you. Dr. Giro's eyes narrowed slightly in confusion as he studied the young man. I can see that, he replied. Though I don't know who you are, my data has no record of you. But the rest of you, yes, I know all of you well, he sneered. I should thank you for saving me the trouble of hunting you down. We weren't about to let you sneak up on us and outnumber us, Trunks shot back, venom dripping from his words. His sharp gaze swept across the battlefield as more figures emerged. Floating behind Dr. Giro was Android 19, a bulky figure dressed similarly to his creator. His rotund frame was offset by his porcelain-like painted face, which gave him an eerie, doll-like appearance. To the side stood Android 17 and Android 18, both with arms crossed and expressions of utter boredom. 17, with his jet black hair tied back, wore a black t-shirt, blue jeans, and an orange scarf. Beside him, his sister, 18, adjusted her blonde hair as her denim vest and skirt caught the sunlight. Finally, another figure descended from above, landing gracefully behind Dr. Jiro. He had blue skin, long blue-green hair, and a muscular build that radiated power. His white chest armor bore the Red Ribbon Army logo, and faint stitches ran along his neck, the only imperfection on his otherwise flawless appearance. Vegeta's eyes narrowed in recognition, his voice a low growl. Zarbone! The figure's lips curled into a smirk. It's 21 now, he said smoothly. A new name for the new power Dr. Jiro has given me, and I intend to use it to tear all of you apart. The Z-Warriors stood in a tense circle, surrounded by the androids. Each fighter's eyes darted between their enemies, assessing the situation. Vegeta's scowl deepened as he struggled to gauge their power.
Which one is the strongest? Vegeta demanded, his voice sharp with frustration. The inability to sense energy from the androids was grating on him. 21. Trunks replied evenly, his gaze locked on the blue-skinned warrior. He's the one who destroyed all of you in the future.
Vegeta's lips curled into a sneer. He's mine, he growled, rocketing toward his former master's lackey without hesitation. I've been meaning to settle the score anyway. I'll back him up, Kakarot said, sparing a glance at the others, before transforming into a Super Saiyan, his golden aura blazing to life. I'll take the girl, Raditz said, nodding toward 18. I've got Jiro, Piccolo said, his sharp Namekian eyes narrowing. I'll handle 17, Trunks said, his voice resolute. Krillin glanced at Tien, Yamcha, and Kyaiotsu. Looks like we've got the big guy, he said, pointing to 19. With their plan in place, Kakarot shot after Vegeta, whose initial assault was already underway. Vegeta closed the distance to 21 in an instant, his fist flying toward the android's face. 21 twisted effortlessly, dodging the blow with almost mocking ease. Kakarot teleported behind 21 just as the android countered, his fist driving into Vegeta's stomach and sending the Saiyan Prince skidding back. Kakarot's leg lashed out in a roundhouse kick aimed at the back of 21's head, but the android turned with lightning speed, blocking the strike with his arm.
I know all your tricks this time, 21 sneered, his voice dripping with venom. And I've got plenty of new ones of my own.
Before 21 could press the attack, Vegeta came at him from the side, forcing the android to turn and engage the prince again. Kakarot saw his chance. As Vegeta traded blows with 21, Kakarot cupped his hands together, gathering energy. The golden light around him intensified as he chanted the familiar words. Ka! Me! Ha! Me! Ha! A massive beam of blue energy tore through the air, aimed straight at 21's back. Without even looking, 21 raised one hand, palm up. The beam collided with his hand and disappeared.
Kakarot's eyes widened in shock. He absorbed it? 21 pivoted, a cruel grin spreading across his face as he redirected the absorbed energy straight at Vegeta. The prince had no time to react as the blast struck him head-on, sending him hurtling into the face of a nearby cliff. The android turned back to Kakarot, his smirk unwavering. As you can see, he said coldly, you're no match for me. I'm going to enjoy tearing you apart.
Not so fast, a deep voice bellowed as Nappa appeared in front of 21. His massive frame blocking the android's view. With a flash of gold, Nappa's aura erupted, his transformation into a Super Saiyan complete. His turquoise eyes glinted with determination, and his golden mustache and eyebrows gleamed in the sunlight. 21 laughed mockingly. That trick again? Don't you insolent monkeys get it? Dr. Jiro studied all your moves and programmed me with everything I need to crush you. There's nothing you can do to surprise me. Nappa clenched his fists, golden energy crackling around him. We'll see about that, he snarled. The ground trembled as he screamed, his power surging higher and higher. So it's going to be that trick, 21 said, rolling his eyes. It didn't work out too well for your... Before he could finish, the sharp gleam of a sword slashed through the air, aimed directly at his head. 21 jerked to the right, the blade missing by mere millimeters. He spun, his hand shooting out to grab the arm that wielded the weapon. A cruel grin spread across his face as he stared into Trunks' determined eyes. I remember you, boy, 21 said, his grip tightening painfully on Trunks' arm. You won't be so lucky this time. Bardock gritted his teeth, feeling his energy slipping away as 21's vice-like grip tightened around his arm. His muscles trembled, his strength fading with every second. The android's power was overwhelming, and he wasn't sure how much longer he could hold on.
"You're finished, boy,"
21 sneered, his cold laughter echoing through the battlefield, just like your future self. Bardock's vision blurred, the edges darkening, when a thunderous voice roared across the sky. "Break cannon!" A beam of golden energy erupted from Nappa's mouth, slicing through the air with devastating force. 21 turned at the last moment, releasing Bardock as he brought his hands together to intercept the attack. The energy blast slammed into his palms, and with shocking ease, he absorbed the entire attack.
"Pathetic," 21 scoffed, his cruel grin widening. "You Saiyans are no match for my power."
With a sudden pivot, the android unleashed the absorbed energy in a massive beam aimed directly at Kakarot, who had teleported behind him, mid-motion for a surprise kick.
The blast struck Kakarot square in the chest, the sheer speed of it catching him off guard. He was hurled backward, the force sending him crashing into the ground with a deafening explosion. Smoke and debris filled the air as the ground trembled beneath the impact. 21 turned back to the others, his laughter cutting through the chaos. "Anyone else want to give it a try?" Nearby, Dr. Juro was locked in a brutal exchange with Piccolo. The Namekian's fists flew with relentless speed and precision, forcing Jiro to stay on the defensive. A sharp jab narrowly missed Jiro's head, grazing his shoulder as he twisted out of the way at the last possible moment.
Jiro's mind raced. This Namekian shouldn't be this powerful, he thought, recalculating his odds. Based on my data, there's no way to beat him at my current energy levels. But a sinister grin crept across his face as he devised a solution. Shifting his weight, Jiro countered with a lightning-fast punch aimed at Piccolo's midsection. Piccolo dodged with ease, his superior speed allowing him to sidestep the attack. The Namekian retaliated with a devastating uppercut, his fist driving into Jiro's metallic stomach, with enough force to send shockwaves through the ground. Jiro staggered, but used the momentum to clamp his hand onto Piccolo's wrist. The moment he made contact, he began draining the Namekian's energy.
Piccolo's eyes widened in shock as a cold, numbing sensation spread through his body. "What?" he managed to say, his voice strained as he tried to pull away. Jiro smirked, tightening his grip. "It's over, Namek," he said, grabbing Piccolo's other arm as the Namekian tried to punch him loose, with both hands secured. Jiro absorbed energy at an even faster rate, his mechanical systems humming with newfound power. Piccolo's knees buckled, his once vibrant aura dimming as his strength drained away. On another part of the battlefield, Krillin and Kyojutsu stood side by side, their faces set with determination. They moved in unison, performing the fusion dance with precision.
Fusion Ha!
A bright flash of light enveloped them, and when it faded, a new warrior stood in their place. Slightly taller than Chiatsu, but shorter than Krillin, the fused being wore an orange GI with a green undershirt. His bald head and rosy cheeks gave him an odd yet intimidating appearance. "I'm Krilltsu," the fusion said, his voice a strange blend of Krillin's and Chaotsu's. He turned just as another blinding light flashed nearby. When the second light faded, Tien and Yamcha's fusion was revealed. The new warrior, Tiencha, stood tall and broad-shouldered, his third eye glowing faintly as his aura flared around him.
Krilltsu grinned. "Let's take care of an android," he said, his energy spiking as he activated a Kaioken X20. "I'm in," Tiencha replied, his own aura igniting with crimson power as he also pushed to a Kaioken X20.
The two fused warriors charged at Android 19, their movements blurring with speed.
19's expression shifted to panic. His internal sensors analyzed the new threats, but there was no data on these warriors. They were familiar, but fundamentally different and far more powerful. Before he could react, Tiencha was upon him, unleashing a rapid barrage of punches and kicks. Each strike connected with brutal force, cracking the android's armor and leaving him reeling. Krilltsu followed, darting in with a spinning kick that sent 19 staggering backward, sparks flying from his damaged frame.
19 tried to counter, his large hands swinging wildly, but the two fused warriors moved too quickly, seamlessly weaving around his attacks. The android systems were overwhelmed, his movement slowing as his power reserves dropped.
"Looks like we've got the upper hand," Tiencha said, a smirk crossing his face as he prepared for the next strike. 19 whirled to grab Tiencha, his massive hands reaching out in desperation. He knew that absorbing energy was his only chance to survive this relentless onslaught. But before he could make his move, a sharp kick landed on his back, sending him stumbling forward. Krilltsu floated behind him, his finger extended and glowing faintly. "You're not going anywhere," the fused warrior said calmly. 19 froze mid-motion, his body locked in place by Kriltsu's psychic hold. His systems whirred and clicked as he struggled against the invisible force, but it was no use. His movements were completely paralyzed. Across from him, Tiancha took his position, forming a triangle with his hands. Crimson energy flared around him as he focused his power. "Tree Kamehameha!" he roared, unleashing a massive beam of blue energy that roared toward the immobilized android. 19's eyes widened in panic. He couldn't raise his hands to absorb the attack, nor could he dodge while trapped by Kriltsu's ability. He had never anticipated such a powerful combination of techniques, and now it was too late. The beam struck him with devastating force, engulfing his entire frame. Circuits sparked and overloaded as his synthetic skin peeled away, revealing the intricate machinery beneath. His processors scrambled to analyze the situation, but the energy was too much. For the first time, fear flashed in the android's artificial eyes, brief but unmistakable, before the explosion consumed him entirely. When the light faded, nothing remained but charred fragments scattered across the battlefield. Kriltsu lowered his hand, his rosy cheeks glinting in the aftermath. "That takes care of him," he said. Tiancha smirked, cracking his knuckles. One down, not far away, Raditz's golden aura flared as he rocketed toward Android 18, each movement faster and more precise than the last. He unleashed a flurry of kicks and punches, each one landing with enough force to send shockwaves through the air. 18 floated back, her expression calm but focused as she shifted into a defensive stance. She raised her arms, blocking and parrying the blows as they came, though each one pushed her farther back. "He's stronger than I expected," she thought. Her teeth gritted, but her confidence didn't waver. Strength alone wasn't enough to win this fight. She knew his moves, every punch, every kick, and she could anticipate his attacks almost perfectly. 18 grinned, her eyes gleaming with cold calculation. Let him wear himself out. He won't last forever. Meanwhile, Trunks, fully transformed into a Super Saiyan, charged Android 17 head-on. His fists glowed with energy as he swung the first punch. 17 raised his arms, blocking the blow effortlessly. The impact pushed him back slightly, but his expression remained calm and unreadable. Trunks pressed on, undeterred. His attacks came faster, harder, forcing 17 to stay on the defensive. For Trunks, this was a rare moment. He was used to being outnumbered, battered, and barely clinging to life in the future timeline. Fighting one-on-one, even against an android, felt like a breath of fresh air. But then, 17's counter came. A sharp punch connected with Trunks' jaw, snapping his head to the side. The impact was jarring, a reminder that this battle was far from over. "Stay focused," Trunks thought, shaking off the hit. He leaped back, cupping his hands at his side as golden energy began to swirl around him. "Kamehameha!" he shouted, releasing a powerful beam of energy that surged towards 17. The android crossed his arms, summoning a shimmering barrier that enveloped him in a protective dome. The beam struck the barrier with a deafening crash, the explosion sending dust and smoke billowing into the air. Trunks grinned, his chest heaving as he caught his breath. "That's got to have done something," he muttered to himself, his confidence building. For the first time, he felt like he was in control of the fight. But as the smoke cleared, his heart sank. 17 stood in the same spot, completely unharmed. The barrier disappeared, and the android dusted himself off with an almost bored expression. Trunks tensed, dropping into a fighting stance as his golden aura flared once more. "Okay," he muttered, steadying his breath. "Guess it's not going to be that easy." 17's lips curved into a faint smirk as he began his counterattack. Kakarot groaned as he pulled himself out of the crater, the debris falling from his shoulders as he stood shakily. He glanced upward, his golden aura flickering weakly. Above him, Bardock and Nappa were locked in a fierce battle with 21. But it was clear they weren't faring well. The android wasn't even trying. He blocked their punches and kicks with effortless precision, almost mocking them with his casual movements. Occasionally, he'd lash out, delivering a crushing blow to one of them, sending them flying back before they regrouped to attack again. Kakarot clenched his fists at his sides, frustration boiling inside him. "We have to stop him here," he thought. "For the sake of everyone on Earth, we can't lose." But no matter how much he pushed himself, his power wasn't responding. He could feel his strength slipping away faster than it should have, even accounting for the energy he'd used. He gritted his teeth, forcing his power to its limits, but his body refused to cooperate. His golden aura flared briefly before flickering out again, weaker than before. Then, A sharp pain stabbed at his chest, stealing his breath. He gasped, clutching his chest as beads of sweat rolled down his face.
What's happening to me? He thought, his heart pounding erratically. Determined not to give up, Kakarot raised his hand to his forehead and teleported behind 21, aiming a punch at the back of the android's head. But his movement was sluggish, too slow in his current state.
21 turned with a smirk, dodging the punch with ease. In a flash, he grabbed Kakarot by the neck, lifting him off the ground. Pathetic, 21 sneered, tightening his grip. Kakarot's vision blurred as his energy drained rapidly. His body felt colder with each passing second, the chill spreading from the android's hand. Realization struck him like a blow. He can absorb energy. That explained why his earlier attack had been useless, and why his strength was fading so fast now. His golden hair dimmed, the glow fading entirely as it reverted to its natural black.
Bardock, still battling nearby, saw his father's transformation fade. Panic flashed through his mind as he watched Kakarot's energy disappear. The memory of the icy sensation when 21 had grabbed him earlier returned in full force. "No!" Bardock shouted, his voice filled with desperation. He knew exactly what was happening, and he knew he didn't have time to hesitate. If he didn't act now, his father wouldn't survive. Fueled by adrenaline and raw emotion, Bardock rocketed toward 21, moving faster than ever before. His golden aura blazed around him like a comet, the sheer force of his speed creating a shockwave in his wake.
21 turned his cold gaze to the young Super Saiyan, a cruel grin spreading across his face. Without releasing Kakarot, the android raised his free hand, a massive orb of stolen energy forming in his palm. "Let's see if you can handle this," 21 said, his voice dripping with malice.
With a flick of his wrist, he hurled the energy blast at Bardock. The attack was enormous, crackling with destructive force as it shot toward the young Saiyan. Bardock had no time to dodge. His instincts screamed at him to brace for impact, but he knew the odds of surviving were slim. He crossed his arms over his face, his golden aura flaring as he prepared for the worst. "I'm not ready to die," Bardock thought, closing his eyes tightly. "But if it means saving my father, then so be it."
The blast raced toward him, the air crackling with energy as it bore down on him. In that moment, everything seemed to slow down. Nappa's sharp eyes followed the massive blast 21 had unleashed at Bardock. The boy stood firm, his arms raised in a defensive stance, his golden aura flaring defiantly. But Nappa knew the truth. There was no way Bardock could survive that attack. The thought hit him harder than he expected. Bardock was just 10 years old and already a Super Saiyan, a feat that astounded even Nappa. The boy's potential was limitless, his power growing at a pace that defied logic. He thought back to when he first met Bardock, only 5 years old at the time. Even then, the boy's raw strength rivaled what Nappa had achieved at nearly 70. This kid might be the planet's only hope, Nappa realized. If anyone can save us from this nightmare, it's him. But not if he dies here. In that split second, Nappa made his decision. Without hesitation, he rocketed toward the descending energy blast, his own aura blazing like a comet. As the blast closed in, Nappa shoved Bardock out of its path with all his strength.
"Live, boy," Nappa muttered, his voice steady, despite the storm of energy bearing down on him. The blast struck Nappa full force. His body was engulfed in a torrent of searing energy that tore through him mercilessly. Flesh burned away, exposing bone until even that disintegrated into ash. A fierce wind scattered what remained of the warrior, leaving nothing behind. Bardock hit the ground hard, rolling several feet before coming to a stop. Dazed, he lifted his head just in time to see the last traces of Nappa vanish into the wind. A tear slipped down his cheek, the weight of the sacrifice sinking in. But there was no time for grief. His father was still in danger. Bardock pushed himself to his feet, wiping the tear away as his gaze locked onto 21. The android still held Kakarot by the neck, his grip unrelenting. Before Bardock could act, a boot slammed into 21's face with a thunderous crack, sending the android staggering. Kakarot dropped to the ground, gasping for air as the grip around his neck released.
21 turned toward the source of the attack, his expression darkening. "Ah, Vegeta," he sneered, addressing the Saiyan prince who now stood before him. Vegeta grinned, his stance confident and unyielding. "It's time you stopped playing with these weaklings and faced a real warrior," he said, his voice dripping with pride. 21 laughed mockingly. "And who would that be?" he asked, the malice in his tone unmistakable. "Super Vegeta," the prince declared. Golden light erupted around him as his aura surged outward. His muscle mass increased slightly, his already impressive frame growing even more formidable as his power climbed to staggering heights. The ground beneath him cracked and splintered under the weight of his energy. After a few seconds, the glow subsided, leaving Vegeta standing tall and composed, his power stabilized at its peak. Bardock, watching from the sidelines, stared in awe. He had felt Vegeta's power before, but this was on an entirely new level. The prince's energy was overwhelming, a force that could rival even the strongest foes. But Bardock couldn't afford to be distracted. He ran to his father, dropping to his knees beside him. Kakarot was unconscious, his breathing shallow and labored. His body was burning up, his skin pale and drenched with sweat. "Dad," Bardock murmured, his voice trembling. He had seen his father beaten and battered in countless battles, but this was different. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. Bardock didn't hesitate. He placed one hand on his father's chest and brought the other to his forehead, mimicking the teleportation technique Kakarot had taught him. "Hang on, Dad," he whispered. In an instant, the two vanished, leaving Vegeta to face Android 21 alone. Zarbon unleashed a blinding energy blast aimed directly at Vegeta, intent on finishing the Saiyan Prince once and for all. But Vegeta, his instincts sharpened by countless battles, ducked beneath the attack at the last possible moment. In the blink of an eye, Vegeta countered with a powerful punch, his fist slamming into Zarbon's midsection with enough force to make the android grunt in pain, a sensation he hadn't experienced since his reconstruction. Pain? Zarbon's mind raced. How could this monkey possibly challenge my upgraded form? His thoughts were abruptly interrupted as Vegeta's boot met his face in a devastating kick, propelling Zarbon backward with such velocity that he smashed into a towering cliff. Rocks and debris rained down around the impact site, shrouding Zarbon in a thick cloud of dust. Vegeta hovered above the chaos, his arms crossed, and a triumphant smirk spreading across his face. "Not so tough now, are you, Tin Can?" he taunted, his voice dripping with disdain. Before Vegeta's words could fully sink in, a brilliant flash of light erupted from the rubble, followed by a shockwave that sent boulders flying in all directions. Zarbon emerged from the dust cloud, his laughter echoing ominously across the battlefield. "Is that all you've got, Vegeta?" Zarbon sneered, his glowing eyes narrowing with malice. Vegeta's smirk didn't waver, not by a long shot. Without warning, he vanished from sight, reappearing in an instant behind Zarbon. With precision and speed, he drove his knee into Zarbon's back, eliciting another grunt of discomfort from the android. But Zarbon wasn't one to be caught off guard for long. He spun around swiftly, his palm open and crackling with energy. He aimed to grab Vegeta and drain the Saiyan's life force. Vegeta, however, anticipated the move. With an iron grip, he caught Zarbon's hand mid-swing, halting the attack before it could land. "You're getting predictable," Vegeta remarked, his voice tinged with mockery. Yet even as their hands locked in a test of strength, Vegeta felt a sudden, sharp pull. His energy began to seep away, drawn through Zarbon's palm like water through a sieve. Zarbon's lips curled into a smug smile. "Can't you see the futility in fighting me, Vegeta?" Zarbon taunted. "Your strength is mine now." Vegeta's eyes widened as he realized what was happening, but his defiant spirit refused to waver. "I'm not beaten that easily," he roared, channeling his frustration into a brutal counterattack. He drove his knee upward into Zarbon's stomach, the force of the blow forcing Zarbon to release his grip and stumble back. Seizing the opportunity, Vegeta launched himself forward to press his advantage, but Zarbon, quick to recover, raised his hand and unleashed a blinding energy blast infused with the very power he had just stolen from Vegeta. The attack struck Vegeta square in the chest, sending the Saiyan Prince hurtling backward, smoke rising from his armor as he skidded to a halt in the dip. Far from the battlefield, Bardock appeared in the sleek confines of Capsule Corporation. His father slumped heavily against him. Bulma stood at her workbench, tools scattered around her as she concentrated on a small, intricate device. The hum of machinery filled the air, the only sound in the lab until Bardock's voice cut through. "Mom!" Bardock called urgently as he entered, his tone a mix of worry and urgency. Bulma turned sharply at the sound of her son's voice. Her gaze quickly shifted to the scene before her. Bardock with minor scrapes and burns, his clothes torn but otherwise unharmed, and Kakarot barely able to stand. The older son was pale, his breaths coming in shallow, labored gasps. Sweat drenched his face, and his hand clutched his chest as if to stave off some invisible pain. "What happened?" Bulma demanded, her voice laced with concern as she hurried over. I don't know, Bardock admitted, his brow furrowed. We were fighting the androids, and Dad just collapsed. One minute he was holding his own, and the next, he was clutching his chest like this. Bulma's eyes darted to her husband, assessing his condition. Did the androids hurt him? Did they do something to him? She pressed, her tone sharp. One of them grabbed him, Bardock explained, his expression darkening. It started draining his energy, but that can't be the problem. It let go after a few seconds, and I got grabbed too. The effect faded as soon as we broke free. This is something else. Dad looks like he's dying. Bulma's gaze lingered on Kakarot's hand, still clutching his chest in visible agony. Was he injured there? She asked, her mind already racing through possibilities.
Bardock shook his head firmly. No, he wasn't even hit there during the fight. Bulma's jaw tightened as she processed the information. Lay him down on the table, she instructed, pointing to the examination table across the room. I'll take a closer look and figure out what's wrong. Trunks gritted his teeth, his arms raised in a desperate attempt to block another bone-rattling blow from Android 17. Each strike sent tremors down his frame, his muscles burning from exhaustion. He had been locked in this battle for what felt like hours, and it was taking its toll. 17, however, showed no signs of fatigue. The android's unrelenting assault only grew sharper and more precise, his movements as fluid as they were mechanical.
17 smirked, sensing Trunks' growing struggle. Getting tired, Saiyan? He mocked, his voice calm yet dripping with disdain. You organics are all the same, so fragile. Trunks didn't respond, focusing instead on deflecting 17's next punch. He knew better than to waste energy on words. I just need to hold on a little longer, he thought, though even he wasn't sure how much longer his body could endure. 17's attacks became a blur, each blow more calculated than the last. At the start of their battle, Trunks had been a challenge, forcing 17 to put some effort into the fight. But now it felt like a chore. 17 sighed, taking a brief pause to scan the battlefield.
His sister, 18, was toying with Raditz. The long-haired Saiyan had fought valiantly, but it was clear he couldn't keep up with her. 18 dodged his attacks effortlessly, occasionally landing sharp counters that left Raditz visibly weakened. 17 chuckled to himself. Almost too easy, he muttered. His eyes flicked over to Zarbon, who was locked in a fierce battle with Vegeta. The Saiyan Prince's power had spiked significantly, and it was clear Zarbon was struggling to keep up. Still, it was enough to keep the overpowered brute busy. Most importantly, Jiro's enforcer wasn't anywhere near the scientist himself. 17's smirk widened as a plan formed in his mind. Turning back to Trunks, he gave a quick nod to his sister across the battlefield. 18 returned the gesture, understanding immediately.
Without warning, 17 drove a devastating uppercut into Trunks' stomach. The impact forced the air from Trunks' lungs, his body folding in pain. Before the Saiyan could recover, 17 followed up with a double-fisted hammer strike to the back of his head. The blow sent Trunks hurtling toward the ground, crashing into the dirt with enough force to carve out a crater. Stay down, 17 muttered, raising one hand. A brilliant sphere of energy formed in his palm, crackling ominously. Without hesitation, he launched it into the crater, the resulting explosion sending smoke and debris spiraling into the air. Satisfied that Trunks wouldn't be getting back up anytime soon, 17 turned his attention toward Jiro. 18, having dispatched Raditz, joined him mid-air as they flew toward their maker. The two androids landed in front of the old scientist, who stood wide-eyed and defensive. What are you doing? Dr. Jiro demanded, his voice trembling with a mix of anger and panic. You should be killing the Saiyans. 17 crossed his arms, a smirk playing on his lips. We're tired of taking orders from you, old man. 18 nodded in agreement, her tone colder. And without your enforcer here to babysit us, we decided it's time to assert our independence. Dr. Jiro's face twisted in rage. You insolent! His outburst was cut short as 17 moved faster than the eye could follow, delivering a high kick that severed Jiro's head from his shoulders in one clean motion. The scientist's body crumpled to the ground, sparks flying from the exposed wires and circuits in his neck. 18 stared dispassionately at Jiro's headless body. That was quick. 17 glanced down, unimpressed. He wasn't worth dragging it out. Without ceremony, he brought his boot down on Jiro's head, crushing it with a sickening crunch. The remaining sparks faded, leaving only silence. What about that hulking mess over there? 18 asked, nodding toward the distance where Jiro's enforcer was still battling Vegeta. He's not our problem, 17 replied. Let's head back to the lab and activate 16. 18 raised an eyebrow. 16? Are you sure his programming is stable? Jiro avoided using him for a reason? That's exactly why he deserves a chance, 17 said, his tone more contemplative. Jiro didn't like him because he couldn't be controlled. Sounds like our kind of guy to me. 18 smirked slightly. Her interest peaked. Fair enough. Let's see what he's capable of. The two androids took off, heading for Jiro's lab with newfound purpose. Kriltsu and Tiencha watched from a distance as 17 and 18 finished off Jiro. The two fused warriors exchanged uneasy glances. Unexpected, Kriltsu said, his voice tinged with confusion. Why would they turn on him like that? Tiencha shook his head. I don't know. Maybe they got tired of being controlled. Doesn't matter, Kriltsu said, his gaze shifting toward Vegeta's battle with Jiro's enforcer. It looks like Vegeta could use some help. Tiencha nodded, his voice resolute. We'll have to move fast. The fusion's going to wear off any minute now. Their fiery auras flared to life, blazing red as they pushed the Kaioken to its absolute limit. With a shared battle cry, the fused warriors charged toward the fray, ready to tip the scales. 21 stood over Vegeta, his expression smug as the sane prince forced himself to his feet. Vegeta's body bore the scars of his grueling battle with Zarbon. His armor cracked, his breath labored, but his fiery resolve remained unbroken. Are you about done yet, Vegeta? 21 taunted, his tone dripping with mockery. How many times do I have to beat you before you realize you can't win? There's no way for you to defeat me. Vegeta wiped a thin trickle of blood from his mouth with the back of his hand. He didn't answer immediately, his mind racing. How could this be happening? Even after ascending beyond Super Saiyan, it still isn't enough. He recalled his daughter's warnings from the other timeline, the tales of how the androids had defeated him, even after he had achieved Super Saiyan. Back then, he had dismissed it as an exaggeration, convinced that the transformation represented the ultimate pinnacle of power. But when he experienced the crushing reality of those words, he had sought a new level, training relentlessly until he unlocked the power to ascend beyond. Yet here he was, still struggling to match his opponent's strength. It wasn't just brute force. Zarbon matched his power and outpaced him in speed. Worse still, his ascended form sacrificed agility for raw power, making it harder to keep up with the android's movements. Zarbon's uncanny ability to anticipate every move and absorb energy attacks made the situation even more dire. Frieza always overestimated you, Zarbon sneered, appearing suddenly in front of the battered prince. Vegeta barely managed to rise before Zarbon towered over him, his smirk twisting into a cruel grin. I never understood what he saw in a weakling like you. Insolent, arrogant, and far too fragile for your own good. Zarbon extended one hand, forming a pulsating ball of crackling energy, its glow illuminating the grim expression on Vegeta's face. And now, it's time to end this. I'm going to enjoy killing you. Before Zarbon could strike, a blur of motion interrupted his focus. A sharp kick connected with his jaw, snapping his head to the side and sending him stumbling back. Not if we have anything to say about it, a voice shouted. Tiencha landed in front of Vegeta, his fused form brimming with energy, as his partner, Kriltsu, joined him. Together, they formed a shield between Vegeta and Zarbon. Zarbon recovered quickly, flipping back to land on his feet. His piercing gaze fell on the two newcomers. And who are you supposed to be? He asked, his voice laced with disdain. His internal scouter quickly analyzed their power levels, noting the faint red glow of the Kaioken technique, amplifying their energy. It doesn't matter. Even together, you don't stand a chance. Tiencha's face remained determined. We'll see about that, he replied coolly. Without waiting for Zarbon to make the first move, Tiencha raised his hands to his face. A sudden burst of blinding light exploded outward. Solar flare, he shouted. Zarbon cursed, staggering back as his vision was consumed by the intense flash. Gah! That trick won't... Kriltsu seized the opening, forming a spinning destructo disc above his head. With a sharp motion, he hurled it toward Zarbon, aiming to sever the android's head once again. But Zarbon was prepared. Still partially blinded, he extended his hand and caught the destructo disc mid-flight. Its energy sizzled in his palm before being completely absorbed into his system. He laughed mockingly, his sight slowly returning. Nice try, but didn't I tell you? I know all of your attacks. Before the warriors could react, Zarbon countered with a beam of radiant energy, vibrant and destructive. Beautiful blast, he roared, as the beam erupted toward Tiencha and Kriltsu, lighting up the battlefield in a dazzling explosion of power. Meanwhile, in the calm of Capsule Corporation's lab, Bulma emerged from her workstation, a mixture of frustration and concern etched on her face. Bardock was pacing nearby, glancing anxiously at his father, who lay unconscious on the examination table. How is he?
Bardock asked, his voice trembling slightly as he stopped mid-step. Bulma sighed heavily. It looks like he's suffering from a heart virus, she explained. I've never seen anything like it before. It's aggressive, and there's no known cure. Not yet, at least.
Bardock's heart sank. Is he going to make it? He asked, his voice quiet but tense. I don't know, Bulma admitted. I ran a full analysis of the virus's genetic makeup. Based on that, I managed to formulate an experimental medicine. But she hesitated, her eyes flicking to Kakarot's pale, sweat-drenched face. It's untested. I have no idea if it'll work.
Bardock clenched his fists, his jaw tightening. So all we can do is wait? Bulma nodded solemnly. Yes, for now, that's all we can do. Bardock stepped closer to his father, his expression softening as he placed a hand on the older Saiyan's shoulder. Come on, Dad, he whispered, his voice filled with determination. We need you more than ever. The androids are still out there, and we can't win this without you. Raditz and Trunks stood at a distance, their expressions grim as they watched the battlefield unfold before them. Zarbon was overwhelming the two fused warriors, who despite their best efforts, were struggling to hold their ground. The monstrous androids showed no signs of tiring, while Kriltsu and Tiencha were clearly reaching their limits. Trunks clenched his fists, his voice strained with frustration. We need to do something. If we don't step in now, they're going to— Stay calm, Raditz interrupted, his tone steady despite the situation. Rushing in without a plan will just get us all killed. Neither of us is strong enough to take that thing head on right now. But we can't just stand here and do nothing. Trunks shot back, his voice rising with urgency. I know, Raditz said firmly, keeping his composure. But acting without thinking is worse. We need a plan. He paused, his sharp eyes studying the situation. Did your father teach you instant transmission while you trained with him? Trunks hesitated, a flicker of doubt crossing his face. He did, but I haven't mastered it yet. I can use it, but it takes a lot of focus. Raditz nodded, formulating a plan on the spot. Good enough. Here's what I need you to do. Get Piccolo out of here and back to Capsule Corp. Once he's safe, I'll handle the rest. Trunks frowned, unsure. What are you planning to do? Raditz smirked, though there was little humor in it. Something Saiyan pride hates to do. Retreat, the battlefield. Zarbon moved with terrifying speed, closing the distance between himself and the fused warriors. With a single, powerful backhand, he sent Kriltsu and Tiencha flying to the side. Their bodies slammed into the ground with a heavy thud, as Zarbon turned his attention back to his true target, Vegeta. The Saiyan Prince had recovered just enough to summon the last reserves of his energy. He launched himself at Zarbon with a defiant roar, throwing a right hook aimed at the android's face. But Zarbon sidestepped the attack effortlessly, his speed far outmatching Vegeta's. Pathetic, Zarbon muttered before retaliating. He delivered a devastating blow to Vegeta's head, the force of the strike knocking the prince nearly unconscious. Vegeta's golden hair faded back to black as his Super Saiyan form collapsed, his body too drained to sustain it any longer. Zarbon sauntered forward, laughing mockingly. Oh, how the mighty Saiyan prince has fallen. You're nothing without your little golden glow, are you? His voice dripped with malice as he raised one hand, energy gathering into a brilliant orb above his palm. Well, Vegeta, it looks like this is the end. Time to say goodbye. Before Zarbon could unleash his finishing move, a voice rang out behind him. Grab hold! In an instant, Raditz appeared between Vegeta and Zarbon, his aura flaring with the power of his Super Saiyan transformation. The two fused warriors, battered but conscious, quickly scrambled to place their hands on Raditz's shoulder. At the same moment, Raditz grabbed the unconscious Vegeta with his other hand, placing his fingers to his forehead. You're not finishing anyone today, Raditz snarled. Just as Zarbon unleashed his devastating blast, the group vanished in a flash of light, leaving the energy attack to erupt harmlessly against the charred ground. Raditz appeared in the familiar halls of Capsule Corporation, carrying Vegeta, with Kriltsu and Tiencha in tow. Seconds after their arrival, the fusion between Krillin and Tien broke, splitting them back into their original forms. The two warriors stumbled slightly, clearly exhausted from the strain of the battle. Krillin wiped the sweat from his forehead, his voice shaky. What do we do now? Even fusion wasn't enough to stop that monster. Raditz laid Vegeta down gently and turned to address the group. We regroup and come up with a new plan. We're not strong enough to take Zarbon down head on, not yet. At that moment, Bardock entered the room, his expression somber as he surveyed the battered warriors. Where's Kakarot? Raditz asked, his voice low but urgent. Bardock folded his arms, his face grim. He's in the med bay. Raditz's brow furrowed. How bad is it? It's not good,
Bardock admitted. Trunks stepped forward, setting Piccolo down carefully. What about the Senzu beans? They could heal him, right? Bardock shook his head. It's not that simple. He's not physically injured. Not in the way Senzu beans can fix. He's dealing with some kind of heart virus. We already tried using a bean, but it didn't do any good. Bardock pulled out the bag of remaining beans and tossed them to Raditz. Here, pass these around. At least the rest of you can heal. Raditz distributed the beans to Krillin and Tien, as Trunks frowned in concern. How's he holding up? Bulma entered the room, overhearing the question. Her face was a mix of worry and determination. We don't know yet. I've developed an experimental medicine to counter the virus, but it's untested. All we can do now is wait and hope. Raditz clenched his fist, his frustration evident. So we're stuck waiting? Kakarot's out, Vegeta's down, and we're not strong enough to take on those androids. This is bad.
Bardock nodded solemnly. It gets worse. The other two androids, 17 and 18, they killed Jiro and then took off. We have no idea where they went. Where do you think they're headed? Bardock asked, looking at the group for answers.
Trunks crossed his arms, his expression thoughtful but troubled. I don't know, he admitted, his voice heavy. In the other timeline, 17 and 18 didn't seem to care much about Jiro. They followed his orders, but you could tell they resented him. Killing him like they did now, that's definitely new. Zarbin might have been the reason they stayed in line before, but with him distracted fighting my dad, they probably saw their chance to take him out. Raditz nodded, his face hardening. Zarbin's arrogance might have worked in their favor this time. Still, it's strange. Killing their creator doesn't exactly fit their usual MO. Yeah, Trunks agreed, his gaze distant. In my timeline, Jiro kept control over them through fear. They may have hated him, but they never outright defied him like this. Without him, who knows what they'll do now that they're free? Krillin, leaning against the wall, chimed in with a nervous edge to his voice. Whatever they're planning, Zarbin is still the bigger problem. Those two might be unpredictable, but Zarbon's a walking disaster waiting to happen. He's already proven he's stronger than all of us combined. Raditz frowned, his eyes narrowing. Don't forget, Zarbin worked for Frieza. He's not just strong, he's ruthless. If it suits him, he won't hesitate to wipe this entire planet out just to smoke us out. Frieza's goons were always like that. The room fell into a tense silence, the weight of the situation pressing down on everyone. Bardock broke it, his tone blunt but serious. So what do we do? Sitting here isn't going to solve anything. Raditz let out a frustrated sigh, running a hand through his wild hair. I wish I knew. The way things are now, we don't have the strength to take him on head to head. Even with Kakarot in fighting shape, we'd still be at a serious disadvantage. Far away, deep within the steel labyrinth of Jiro's hidden laboratory, 17 and 18 strolled into the dimly lit chamber. The faint hum of machinery echoed through the room, accompanied by the occasional flicker of overhead lights. Ah, home sweet home, 17 said with a wry smile, his hands clasped behind his head as he looked around. 18 shot him a glare. Oh, shut up. You know I hate this place. I'm just kidding, 17 replied, his smirk widening. He walked toward a sleek high-tech pod that stood upright against the wall. Inside, a towering android lay dormant, his broad frame encased in green armor. A red mohawk adorned his otherwise bald head, and his expression was calm, almost serene. Well, time to wake up our old friend, 17 said, placing a hand on the control panel. With a quick series of button presses, the pod began to rumble, steam hissing from its seams. A faint glow surrounded the android within as the pod's door slowly slid open.
The towering figure stirred, his blue eyes blinking open for the first time in years. He sat up, his movements precise and deliberate, and looked around with an air of quiet intensity. Where am I? He asked, his voice deep and calm.
17 stepped back, gesturing casually. We woke you up. Now the question is, what do we do next? The newly awakened android, designated 16, tilted his head slightly, his gaze steady. I am programmed to kill Kakarot, he said simply, his tone devoid of emotion. 18 rolled her eyes. Figures, he's got a one-track mind. 17 chuckled. Well, at least he's consistent. Still, this could be fun. Kakarot disappeared early in the battle, but I wouldn't mind tracking him down myself. A scavenger hunt could spice things up. 18 leaned against the wall, her expression bored but slightly amused. Why not? It's not like we've got anything better to do. 16 stood, towering over the siblings, his presence imposing yet oddly serene. Kakarot must be eliminated, he repeated, his unwavering focus leaving no doubt about his intent. Bardock, Trunks, and Raditz each completed their 10,000th push-up under the crushing pressure of 400 times Earth's gravity. Sweat poured down their faces and bodies, muscles straining as they fought through the intense training. The gravity chamber hummed faintly, a stark contrast to the grunts of effort that echoed within. For 4 days straight, they had pushed their limits, knowing full well their lives and the fate of the planet depended on it. Despite their determination, they remained cautious, carefully suppressing their power levels. Any significant surge might attract the androids, a risk they couldn't afford to take. 17 and 18 had been eerily absent since their last appearance, but 21 had made his presence known. Cities lay in ruins from his devastating assaults, a calculated effort to lure them out. Each time, they had resisted the urge to intervene, knowing they weren't ready. Not yet. Frustration weighed heavily on them. Their pride as Saiyans warred with their cold logic. They wanted to fight, to defend the innocent, but the truth was undeniable. They couldn't win. Not against 21, not as they were now.
Damn it, Bardock muttered, his fist slamming into the floor, leaving a small dent. We're just sitting here while he tears the world apart. We don't have a choice, Trunks said, his voice tense. He wiped sweat from his brow, his violet hair clinging to his face. If we go out there and lose, who's left to stop him? Raditz, leaning against the wall, arms crossed, scowled, but said nothing. He hated being powerless, but Trunks was right. Adding to their worries was the absence of Vegeta and Piccolo. Vegeta had vanished, presumably to train on his own, as he often did. Piccolo, ever the lone wolf, had left without a word. The remaining Saiyans and their human allies had spent hours brainstorming a plan, but beyond training harder, they had little to show for their effort.
The gravity chamber's intercom crackled to life, breaking the tense silence. I need you in the med center. Bulma's voice came through, calm but insistent. The 3 Saiyans exchanged glances before springing into action, dashing out of the gravity room. Within moments, they burst into the med center, their battle-worn features lighting up with hope at the sight before them. Kakarot, their comrade and family, was sitting up in bed, grinning as if he hadn't been on the brink of death. I see you're happy to see me, he said, his voice warm and lighthearted. Dad! Bardock stepped forward, his usual stoicism faltering. Relief softened his rough edges. I was worried you wouldn't make it. I probably wouldn't have, Kakarot admitted, glancing at Bulma with gratitude. If it wasn't for the genius of your mother. Bulma crossed her arms and smirked. Don't mention it, literally. You Saiyans don't thank me enough as it is. Trunks stepped closer, his expression serious. We've got a lot to tell you about the androids. I'm up to speed, Kakarot replied casually. I saw everything in my dreams. Raditz raised an eyebrow. So you already know how bad it is? Kakarot nodded, his tone growing serious. Bad doesn't even begin to cover it, but I've been thinking. I have an idea. Well, don't keep us waiting, Raditz said, eager for a solution. When I was training with Kami to prepare for Chomper's arrival, Kakarot began. He told me about a special room. In this room, 1 year of training equals just 1 day on the outside. Bardock's eyes widened. The hyperbolic time chamber, Kakarot nodded. At the time, I wasn't ready to survive a full day in there, but now, I think it's our best shot. Best shot? Raditz echoed. It's our only shot. The group fell silent, the weight of Kakarot's suggestion sinking in. There was a spark of hope in their eyes now, tempered by the immense challenge ahead. High above Earth, Piccolo stood on the lookout, his piercing gaze fixed on Kami. The elder Namekian's expression was calm, but his eyes held unease as he listened to Piccolo's argument. You're still not convinced? Piccolo growled, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. 21 is a walking catastrophe. He could destroy the Earth without breaking a sweat. Kami's expression didn't waver. I know 21 is dangerous, but the others haven't proven themselves as threats. They haven't proven themselves because they haven't needed to. Piccolo shot back. His voice was rising, but he didn't care. Do you really think 17 and 18 are just going to stand by while 21 does all the work? Kami sighed, his shoulders slumping slightly. You're asking me to make a choice I've avoided for centuries, Piccolo. If we fuse, I cease to exist as I am. So do you. Piccolo took a step closer, his jaw tightening. And if we don't fuse, none of us will exist. The androids aren't going to stop. They'll wipe out everything. Do you want that on your conscience? The lookout fell silent, the weight of the decision pressing down like gravity. Piccolo waited, his eyes locked on Kami, hoping against hope that the old Namekian would set aside his doubts before it was too late. Kami's gaze was distant, his normally composed expression suddenly betraying a deep unease. His earlier words hung heavy in the air. I think the Saiyans could handle him. he had said moments ago, but his face had now paled considerably. "What is it, Kami?" Mr. Popo asked, his voice calm but tinged with concern as he studied the Guardian's sudden change in demeanor. Kami didn't respond to Mr. Popo. Instead, he turned to Piccolo, his ancient eyes now sharp with resolve. "We need to fuse." Piccolo blinked, taken aback by the sudden shift. His arms crossed as he glared at Kami, his skepticism evident. "Why the sudden change? You've been arguing against this for days." "There's no time to explain," Kami said urgently. "Once we're fused, you'll understand everything." Piccolo hesitated only a moment before his lips curled into a thin, determined smirk. "Fine, but we do it my way. We use my body." Kami nodded without protest. "All right." Without further hesitation, Kami raised his hand and placed it firmly on Piccolo's chest. A glow of pure white light engulfed his form, and within moments, the Guardian of Earth faded into a stream of energy that merged seamlessly into Piccolo's body. Power surged through Piccolo, their unified being. His aura flared violently, the sheer force of it cracking the tiles beneath his feet. He flexed his fingers, marveling at the raw strength coursing through his veins. He felt invincible, a force unlike anything he had ever known. "This is incredible," he muttered, his voice deep and resonant, though tinged with awe. "I can feel it, the power, the clarity. I understand now." Without another word, the newly fused Namek launched himself into the sky, a streak of green and white light. His destination, the ominous presence Kami had sensed moments before their union. The Z-Warriors arrived at the lookout, their faces grim but filled with resolve. They had come seeking answers and strength. "Welcome," Mr. Popo greeted them, stepping forward with his usual calm demeanor, though his eyes betrayed a shadow of concern. Kakarot, standing at the forefront, spoke first. "I need to talk to Kami." Mr. Popo hesitated. "I'm afraid Kami has fused with Piccolo. He made the decision to help protect the Earth." Kakarot's expression shifted, his trademark grin appearing briefly. "That's fine. I'm sure they're even stronger now. We're gonna need that strength." The cheerful tone quickly faded as Kakarot's eyes narrowed with purpose. "Mr. Popo, we need to use the Room of Spirit and Time." Popo's face fell. "Are you certain? The conditions in there are extreme. Not everyone can survive it." "We don't have a choice," Kakarot replied firmly. "If we're going to beat the androids, we have to get stronger. A lot stronger." The genie sighed, but nodded. "Very well. Only 2 people can enter at a time. Who will go first?" Raditz stepped forward immediately, his tail flicking with anticipation. "I'll go." Trunks followed, placing a steady hand on Raditz's shoulder. "I'll go with you," he said, then turned to Bardock. "Hold them off for a day, big brother," he said with a small grin, his tone attempting lightness despite the gravity of their mission. Trunks then walked towards Celia and Chi-Chi, who were standing off to the side. His gaze softened as he approached Celia, gently cupping her face in his hands. He leaned in, pressing a tender kiss to her lips. "Take care of the baby while I'm gone," he said, his voice quiet but filled with emotion as he placed a hand on her stomach. She nodded, her eyes glistening. "Come back to us." With that, Trunks and Raditz strode toward the entrance of the Room of Spirit and Time, determination etched into every step. Piccolo descended into the eerie silence of Ginger Town, his sharp eyes scanning the unsettling scene. The streets were littered with clothes, but no people. It was as if the entire population had simply vanished, leaving only their garments behind. His boots crunched against the pavement as he landed, his cape billowing in the faint wind. "What did this?" he muttered to himself, his voice low and grim. He had already pieced together fragments of the dark feeling Kami had sensed for years, but even with their combined knowledge, he couldn't pinpoint what or who was responsible for the devastation around him. One thing was certain though, whatever had done this couldn't have gone far. "You're right, Namek, I haven't." Piccolo spun around at the sound of the voice, his eyes narrowing as he saw Android 21 hovering lazily in the air behind him, arms crossed. The android's smirk was infuriatingly smug. "What did you do?" Piccolo demanded, his fists clenching as his aura flared slightly. "Me?" 21 replied, feigning hurt as he placed a hand on his chest. "Do you really think I did this?" "Yeah," Piccolo growled, his voice dripping with suspicion. "This seems twisted enough to be your handiwork." 21 chuckled, shaking his head. "You've got a point there, Namek, but give me some credit. Even I'm not capable of something this unique. Clothes left behind, a neat trick, but not one of mine." Piccolo's mind raced as he processed the android's words. He hated to admit it, but they made sense. This wasn't 21's style, as much as he wished it were. If not him though, who? Before Piccolo could voice his thoughts, 21 tilted his head with a mocking smile. So, what brings you here all alone? Did the big bad Saiyans finally leave you to fend for yourself? I don't need them to protect me, Piccolo snapped. His aura flared around him, crackling with energy. I can handle myself just fine. I'm sure you can, said 21, a smirk tugging at the corners of her lips. Her tone was as casual as if she were discussing the weather, but her sharp gaze burned with challenge. Why don't we test that out?
Piccolo stepped forward, his cape billowing slightly in the wind. His stance shifted, legs apart, arms raised. His eyes, narrowed in determination, locked onto his opponent. It'd be my pleasure, he replied, his voice calm yet resolute. I'll show you what a Super Namek can do.
The tension crackled between them, thick as a storm cloud. Nearby, debris from the ruined cityscape littered the ground, silent witnesses to the impending battle. Dust swirled, caught in a gust, as the two warriors squared off.
Not far away, hidden in the shadows of a crumbling building, Cell observed the exchange. His green bioorganic body blended into the shadows as his tail flicked lightly behind him. His insect-like eyes glimmered with intrigue. Interesting. He leaned forward slightly, his sharp features illuminated by a thin sliver of sunlight peeking through the shattered structure. I didn't realize Piccolo had grown this strong. Strange. I was certain he fell to the androids early on.
But the anomaly didn't concern him for long. Cell crossed his arms, his smirk mirroring 21's earlier expression. He could sense their power levels clearly. Piccolo was formidable, but 21's energy eclipsed his. It doesn't matter. He won't defeat her. Turning away, Cell began to creep deeper into the labyrinth of ruins, his footsteps eerily silent. Let them tear into each other like wild animals. The energy they expended would make his task all the easier. I'll be back for you, he muttered under his breath, his tone dripping with malice. The bio-android moved with purpose, his thoughts already turning to his next target. He still needed more biomatter, more power, before he could challenge 21 or anyone else standing in his way. On the lookout, perched high above the Earth's atmosphere, a quiet serenity enveloped Kakarot and Bardock. Both sat cross-legged on the ancient stone tiles, their eyes closed in deep meditation. The distant hum of life below them seemed to fade as they focused inward, their breathing steady and controlled. Bardock cracked an eye open, breaking the silence. Shouldn't we be training more? He asked, his gravelly voice laced with impatience. We could head back home, grab a gravity chamber, and spar or work out. Something to get stronger. Kakarot, still seated with his hands resting on his knees, slowly opened his eyes. His expression was calm, but firm. I think we've done enough of that, he said. Our muscles are already plenty strong. Over the past 3 years, we've pushed our bodies to their limits. But the fight with the androids taught me something more important. Bardock frowned, leaning slightly forward. I know, Dad, he replied. We need to get way stronger. Kakarot shook his head, the gesture subtle but deliberate. It's not just about strength, he said. We've been training like this for years now, and each time the results are smaller and smaller. We've hit a wall. Bardock folded his arms. What are you saying? We give up? No, Kakarot said, his voice sharp with conviction. We need to go beyond what we think a Super Saiyan is capable of. If we want to defeat the androids and anything else out there, we need to master this transformation first. Bardock tilted his head, skepticism etched on his face. You're saying we need to become like Vegeta?
Kakarot shook his head again, this time more emphatically. No, Vegeta's approach isn't the answer. All he did was bulk up his muscles. Sure, his power increased, but he sacrificed speed for it. That kind of trade-off isn't worth it in the long run.
Then what do we do? Bardock pressed. His tone was firm, but beneath it lay a flicker of curiosity. We master the Super Saiyan form, Kakarot explained. Think back to our fight with the androids. At the start, we held our own, but the longer it went on, the faster we tired. Our stamina couldn't keep up. Bardock nodded slowly. Yeah, and the androids have almost unlimited power. They just keep going. Maybe, Kakarot said. Or maybe it's not them. Maybe it's us. Transforming into Super Saiyan takes so much energy that it drains us too quickly. What if we could stay in that form without using up all our stamina?
Understanding dawned in Bardock's eyes. You're saying we just stay as Super Saiyans all the time? Exactly, Kakarot said, but not to fight. Not at first. We'll suppress our power to keep from drawing attention. We're going to live as Super Saiyans, meditating, relaxing, letting our bodies adjust to it. Once it becomes natural, we'll be able to push beyond it.
Bardock scratched the back of his head, still processing the idea. But what about training? How are we supposed to fight in high gravity or work out if we're suppressing our power? We're not going to fight in high gravity, Kakarot replied. Not yet. The point is to ease into it, not force it. Once we've adapted, then we can push our limits again. Bardock smirked, the hint of a challenge in his voice. I think I get it now, but there's one thing I don't understand. If you thought of this earlier, why didn't you tell Raditz or Trunks? Kakarot hesitated, scratching his cheek with a sheepish grin. Well, I'm not sure it'll work. I didn't want to risk the fate of the world on an idea that might not pan out. If we're wrong, maybe Raditz and Trunks will find a better solution. Piccolo launched himself at Zarbon with a ferocity that shook the air around them. His green fists blurred as he unleashed a rapid barrage of punches and kicks, each strike aimed to shatter Zarbon's defenses. But the android barely flinched. Zarbon moved with calculated ease, blocking every attack with a flick of his wrist or a well-placed sidestep. Is that all you've got? Zarbon mocked, his smirk as sharp as the edge of his jawline. I thought you were supposed to be a super Namek. Piccolo gritted his teeth, his frustration mounting. He needed to break through Zarbon's guard. Without hesitation, he extended his arm, stretching it to several times its normal length in a sudden attempt to catch the android off guard. The limb shot forward like a coiled spring unleashed, but Zarbon was ready. The android's hand snapped up, catching Piccolo's elongated fist in mid-air. He tightened his grip, his fingers glowing faintly as a sinister energy pulsed through them. Clever, Zarbon said, his tone dripping with mock approval. But not clever enough. Piccolo's eyes widened as he felt his energy being siphoned away, the life force flowing out of him and into Zarbon. His body weakened, his breathing grew labored, and his strength began to falter. Zarbon chuckled darkly. How does it feel, Namekian? You're only making me stronger. With a desperate grunt, Piccolo yanked back on his arm, putting every ounce of strength into the pull. The force was so great that the limb tore free from his body entirely, green blood spraying into the air. He staggered back, clutching at the bleeding stump where his arm had been. Zarbon stared at the severed limb in mild amusement. What a waste, he said, before tossing it aside like a discarded toy. Then he raised his hand, crimson energy swirling into his palm. Here, have your energy back. Beautiful blast.
The scarlet beam tore through the air, barreling toward Piccolo like a cannonball of raw destruction. Piccolo crossed his remaining arm over his face, bracing himself as best he could. The blast struck, engulfing him in a fiery explosion that sent smoke and debris flying in all directions.
When the smoke cleared, Piccolo stood hunched and burned, his clothes in tatters. His breathing was ragged, but his gaze was defiant. Don't you see the futility of this? Zarbon said, his voice calm but laced with arrogance. My energy never runs out. Anything you throw at me, I'll absorb and send right back at you. Give up now. Save yourself the humiliation. Piccolo's lips curled into a grimace. Never, he growled, before vanishing from sight.
He reappeared behind Zarbon in a flash, his fist driving toward the android's back. But the moment his strike landed, Zarbon's image shimmered and faded. Piccolo's attack passed harmlessly through an afterimage. Too slow, Zarbon taunted, materializing behind Piccolo. His hand shot out, clamping down over Piccolo's mouth. Once again, the android began draining energy from his opponent. This is too easy, Zarbon sneered, his voice low and venomous. He kicked Piccolo hard in the side, sending the Namekian hurtling through the air. Piccolo crashed into the rubble of a nearby building, sending chunks of stone and dust flying in all directions.
Zarbon raised his hand, gathering the stolen energy into a glowing orb. The sphere of light crackled with power, pulsating ominously as he leveled it at the fallen Namekian. I guess I'll kill you now, he said coldly. The blast struck Piccolo square in the chest, slamming him into the ground with devastating force. Smoke and flames rose from the crater where he lay. Zarbon smirked in satisfaction before turning away, his interest in the battle already waning. Without another glance, he took off, leaving the scene behind in search of more chaos to sow. For a moment, silence reigned. Then, with a pained grunt, Piccolo pushed himself up, his body battered and scorched. He staggered to his feet, his breath shallow but determined. I was too reckless, he muttered to himself. The fusion made me feel invincible. I won't make that mistake again. Summoning the regenerative abilities of his Namekian heritage, Piccolo focused his energy. A new arm sprouted from the stump, seamlessly replacing the one he had lost. He flexed his fingers briefly, testing its strength. With a final grunt of effort, he shot into the sky, heading toward the lookout. Outside Capsule Corp, the trio of androids stood amidst the quiet hum of the city. 17 leaned casually against a lamppost, his arms crossed, while 18 and 16 surveyed their surroundings. "Kakarot should be here," 17 said, glancing at the building's sleek exterior. "This is his address." "My scanners detect no sign of Kakarot nearby," 16 said in his monotone voice. His red eyes gleamed faintly as he processed the data. "Looks like he's not home," 18 said with a shrug. "I wonder where he went," 17 mused, his tone more curious than concerned. 16 tilted his head slightly. "My records indicate a 70% probability that he has taken refuge at the residence of his mentor, Master Roshi." "And the other 30%? 18 asked, raising an eyebrow. "There is a 20% chance he has returned to his boyhood home at Mount Paozu. The remaining 10% suggests he is in an unknown location outside of Dr. Jiro's database." 17 smirked, pushing himself off the lamppost. "Roshi's island it is then. Let's pay the old man a visit." "Can we fly this time?" 18 asked. "I'm tired of traveling like humans." "But that's part of the fun," 17 said with a teasing grin. 18 rolled her eyes. "It's only fun for you." Elsewhere in West City, Cell lurked behind the corner of a building, his energy suppressed to near nothing. His sharp gaze followed the android's movements from afar. They were powerful, too powerful for him to face directly. Not yet. But West City was teeming with humans, and humans were precisely what Cell needed. He smiled to himself, his tail flicking eagerly. He had already determined where the androids would go next, and that knowledge would give him the upper hand. "This will be almost too easy," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the distant hum of the city. Then, without a sound, he slipped into the shadows, ready to continue his gruesome evolution. And that's it for today's episode, guys. If you watched to the end, then that could be an indication that you enjoyed the series. So please leave a like on the video. Thank you and take care.